Hey, welcome back. If this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found your way to this little corner of the internet. And if you've been here before, you already know what we do. We slow things down. We tell the stories history forgot to shout about. So go ahead, find a comfortable spot, let the day just fall away. Tonight we're going somewhere most people have never thought to look. Here's something I want you to think about for just a second. What if I told you that one of the most powerful, most connected, most extraordinary civilizations in human history was built not in Rome, not in Athens, not in the warm, sunlit cradle of what we call the ancient world, but on two cold, grey, windswept seas in the far north of Europe, seas so brutal that Roman soldiers once mutinied rather than sail them. Waters so shallow, so freezing, so unforgiving, that the greatest empire in history basically looked at them and said, yeah, no thank you. And yet, from these very shores came the gold resting inside a pharaoh's tomb, the trade routes that taught the world what a free market even was, the ships, the laws, the ideas that quietly, patiently, stubbornly built the foundation of the modern world. Tonight we go to the edge of the world, and we discover it was never the edge at all. Before we dive in, if this is the kind of storytelling that makes you want to stay up just a little longer than you planned, maybe hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a night like this one. It genuinely means everything to a small channel like mine. And I have a question for you. Where are you right now watching this? In bed with the lights off, on the couch with a cup of something warm, maybe somewhere on the other side of the planet where it is not even close to nighttime. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one and I love knowing where these stories travel to. All right, soft light, easy breathing, let's go. Let's start with a little geography. I promise I'll make it worth it. There are two bodies of water at the heart of everything we're going to talk about tonight. The first is the North Sea. It sits between Britain, Norway, Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. It is not a gentle sea. It is cold, moody, and has absolutely no interest in making your life easy. Its average depth in most areas is only around 90 meters, which sounds like a lot until you realize the Atlantic Ocean right next door drops to nearly 3,000 meters in places. By ocean standards, the North Sea is essentially a very large, very dangerous, extremely cold puddle. The second is the Baltic Sea, even shallower, even colder for most of the year, nearly landlocked, wrapped around by what is today Sweden, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Germany, and Denmark. Its water is so diluted with fresh water because dozens of rivers pour into it that in some winters the northern portions freeze completely solid. Not just a thin crust, solid. People walked across it. Horses and carts made the crossing on ice. In the 17th century, the Swedish army once marched an entire military force, soldiers, cavalry, cannons across the frozen Baltic to attack Denmark. And it worked. Now, if you were a scholar in ancient Rome and someone described these two seas to you, your first reaction would probably be, well, that sounds absolutely miserable. Why on earth would anyone choose to live there? And honestly, that is a completely reasonable thing to wonder, because the Mediterranean by comparison was a dream. Warm, predictable, calm enough for most of the year that you could sail it in a wooden boat without constantly wondering if today was the day you drowned. The Greeks had olive groves and sunshine. The Romans had wine and engineering and sophisticated roads. The Mediterranean was in the ancient world's eyes civilization, the North Sea. The Romans called it Oceanus Germanicus, the German Ocean. And their feelings about it were, let's say, complicated. There are actual historical accounts of Roman legions standing on the coast of what is today northern France, staring out at the grey, churning, howling water ahead of them, and simply refusing to go further. Not one or two soldiers, entire units. Mutiny because the sea frightened them that much. The great Roman historian Tacitus wrote about the people living along the northern coasts of Europe, describing a land of gloomy skies, harsh winds, and barren stretches of grey. He wasn't wrong about the weather, to be fair, but what he completely missed, what most of the ancient Mediterranean world completely missed, was what those people were building in the middle of all that grey. And here is where the story gets genuinely interesting. Because difficult places have a remarkable way of producing extraordinary people. Think about it this way. If your environment gives you nothing for free, no warmth year-round, no naturally rich farmland in many areas, no gentle river to float your goods downstream without effort, then you are forced to develop something that softer climates never require of you. You're forced to get creative. You are forced to trust your neighbours, cooperate with strangers, share resources, and think ahead in ways that the comfortable rarely need to bother with. The people who settled along the Baltic and North Sea coasts across thousands of years and dozens of different cultures did all of that and more. They learned to read the sea the way most people read a familiar face. The colour of the water that meant a storm was building, the depth of the currents that told you exactly where you were even without being able to see the shore. The behaviour of certain birds that signalled land was close. They built boats not for the calm, predictable Mediterranean, but for brutal, grey-heaving, absolutely unforgiving northern swells. Boats with shallow drafts that could navigate rivers deep into the continent. Boats that could be dragged up onto beaches. Boats that were in their own way engineering masterpieces. And they developed trade networks. Not small local networks, not just a village here, a settlement there. We are talking about connections that stretched at their height from the frozen northern tip of Norway all the way down to the eastern Mediterranean, to the Black Sea, to Egypt. We know this is true, not because of legend or myth, because of physical evidence sitting in museums right now quietly waiting for people to pay attention to it. There is a substance, warm-coloured, golden translucent. It washes up on Baltic beaches after storms carried in by the sea from the ancient seabed. It is the fossilised resin of trees that existed 55 million years ago, long before humans ever walked the earth. Over millions of years that resin hardened into something astonishing, something that catches light in a way that seems almost alive. Ancient cultures who could not explain where it came from invented myths to account for it. Some believed it was solidified sunlight, or the tears of gods, or the crystallized grief of the earth itself. The ancient Greeks called it electron, and yes, that is exactly where the word electricity comes from, because they noticed it created a spark of static energy when rubbed against cloth. They were not entirely wrong about the magic. We call it amber, and it is going to take us in just a moment on one of the most extraordinary journeys in all of human history, because here is the detail that I cannot stop thinking about. The breast ornament of the Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun, one of the most famous burial treasures ever discovered, now resting in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, contains large amber beads. And those beads were tested, scientifically chemically analysed, and the result was unambiguous. They came from the Baltic coast, a boy king buried in the Egyptian desert 3,000 years ago, wearing the fossilised tears of ancient trees from the frozen shores of northern Europe. That connection did not happen by accident. It was built slowly, deliberately across countless generations of traders and carriers and middlemen by the people living on these cold, grey, unremarkable-looking shores. The edge of the world, no. This was always the centre of something. The question is just how did they do it? And what did their actual lives look like day by day on those windswept beaches and foggy river mouths? What did they eat, fear, believe, and build? Because the amber is just the beginning, just the first thread in a story that stretches across thousands of years and touches almost every corner of the world in ways that most history books never quite explain. So let's pull on that thread. Let's follow the amber all the way from a stormy Baltic beach through river crossings and mountain passes and ancient sea roads until it rests golden and warm against the chest of a pharaoh in the Egyptian sand. Come with me. So, let's start with a storm. Not a metaphorical storm. An actual one, the kind that rolls in off the Baltic Sea in late autumn without much warning, turning the water from grey-green to black and piling waves 3, 4, 5 meters high against the flat sandy shores. The kind of storm that if you were a fisherman or a farmer living along those coasts 5,000 years ago, you would have watched from the doorway of your shelter with a mixture of dread and something else. Something harder to name, a kind of anticipation. Because after a storm like that, something happened on the Baltic shore that happened nowhere else in the world with quite the same regularity or quite the same generosity. The sea gave things back, not just debris and seaweed and the occasional lost oar. Scattered among the dark, wet pebbles glowing warm and translucent in the pale morning light, after the storm passed pieces of amber, golden honey-coloured, sometimes deep red-brown, sometimes almost clear as pale tea. Warm to the touch in a way that cold stone never is, light enough that a large piece sat in your palm like almost nothing at all, and if you held it up against the sky, the light passed through it and turned the whole world amber-coloured for just a moment. People had been picking these pieces off the beach for longer than any written record reaches. The oldest worked amber objects found by archaeologists, small carved pendants, beads with carefully drilled holes, date back roughly 13,000 years. 13,000. That is before farming existed in Europe, before pottery, before any of the things we usually think of as the beginning of human civilization. Someone was sitting on the Baltic shore in the Stone Age picking up amber and deciding it was beautiful enough to make into something you could wear. That instinct that this glowing warm thing from the sea deserved to be carried close to the body turned out to be one of the most consequential aesthetic judgments in all of human history. Now here is the question I want to sit with for a moment, because I think it is genuinely one of the most interesting puzzles in ancient history. How does a piece of fossilized tree resin from a cold beach in what is today Lithuania or Poland end up in a royal tomb in Egypt? Not metaphorically, literally, physically. How do you move an object thousands of kilometers across a world with no roads, worthy of the name, no maps, no professional transport infrastructure, and no shared language between the people at either end of the journey? The answer is that you do not do it in one trip. You do it in 100 trips, or 1,000. Each one covering only the distance that one trader in one lifetime in one familiar stretch of territory could reasonably manage. The amber moved the same way a whispered story moves through a crowded room, passed from hand to hand, person to person, each carrier knowing only the next stop on a chain whose full length nobody could see. Archaeologists call this a relay trade system, and the Amber Road, which is what historians eventually named the network of routes that carried Baltic amber southward, was operating in this relay fashion by at least the year 3000 before the Common Era. We know this because Baltic amber beads have been found in burial sites from that period in places as far from the Baltic coast as central Germany and the Alpine foothills of northern Italy. And then by around 1600 before the Common Era, Baltic amber starts appearing in Mycenae, in Greece, on the other side of the continent. The German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann, the man who famously excavated the site of ancient Troy in the 1870s and 1880s, found Baltic amber among the treasures he uncovered there as well. The chemical signature of Baltic amber is distinctive enough to be identified scientifically even after 3,000 years. It contains a specific compound called succinic acid in concentrations of 2 to 8% that is unique to amber from the Baltic region. So when a piece of amber turns up in Greece or Syria or Egypt and scientists test it, they can say with confidence this came from the Baltic coast. This came from the same beaches we have been talking about all evening. That is not guesswork. That is chemistry speaking across 3 millennia. Let me tell you about one specific route because the details make the abstraction real. One of the main northern branches of the Amber Road began on the coast of what is today Lithuania and Poland, the Sambian Peninsula, the great amber-producing region that the ancient world knew as the source of the finest specimens. From there, traders followed the Vistula River southward through the dense forests and river valleys of Central Europe, down through what is today Poland and the Czech Republic, crossing the Danube somewhere in the region of what is today Austria, and then continuing south through the Alpine passes to the head of the Adriatic Sea, at the ancient port city of Aquileia, near what is today Venice. From Aquileia, the amber entered the Mediterranean trading world. From there it could go east to Greece or further east to the Levant or south across the sea to Egypt. The total distance from the Baltic coast to Egypt, depending on the exact route, was somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 kilometres. For most of human history, covering that distance with any kind of regular, reliable flow of goods was an almost unimaginable logistical achievement. And yet the amber moved, consistently, for thousands of years. You want to know something that I find almost funny in the best possible way? Some of the clearest evidence for the scale of this trade comes not from spectacular tomb finds, but from a much more prosaic discovery. Near the city of Wrocław in present-day Poland, archaeologists found 3 large ancient amber storage depots. Together, the 3 sites contained approximately 2,750 kilograms of raw amber, nearly 3 tons of amber sitting in warehouses at a waypoint on the ancient trade route. Because the trade was regular enough and substantial enough that it needed warehousing infrastructure. This was not occasional gifting between distant cultures. This was commerce. Organised, sustained, infrastructure-supported commerce, operating roughly 5,000 years before the Hanseatic League invented the idea of organised Baltic trade, which tells you something important about these Baltic shores. The people here were not waiting for civilization to arrive from the south. They were supplying it. I want to pause here and ask you something directly because I am genuinely curious. Have you ever held a piece of amber? Not in a jewellery store where it is mounted and finished and presented as something precious. Just a raw piece picked off a beach or bought from a market stall somewhere on the Baltic coast, because if you have, you know that there is something about the physical experience of amber that explains better than any historical argument why it travelled so far for so long. It is warm in your hand in a way that stone is not. It is light. It glows from the inside when you hold it to any kind of light. And if you are lucky enough to find one with an inclusion, a tiny bubble of air, or better yet an insect or a fragment of ancient plant matter preserved inside, there is a feeling that is genuinely difficult to describe. A feeling of contact with something impossibly old, 55 million years old. The ancient Greeks noticed this feeling. They created a myth about it. They said amber was the tears of the Heliades, the sisters of Phaeton, the boy who tried to drive the sun chariot and fell. The sisters wept for him at the edge of the great northern river, and their tears hardened into amber where they fell into the water. It is a beautiful myth, and like most beautiful myths, it is reaching towards something true, in this case the truth that amber seems to contain time itself. The Greeks also noticed something else. When you rub amber vigorously against cloth, it develops a static electric charge that attracts light objects toward it. They named this property after the material. Their word for amber was electron, from which across several thousand years and several linguistic transformations we eventually derived the word electricity. The people who named electricity named it after a piece of fossilized resin from a Baltic beach. That line of inheritance running from a Stone Age beachcomber to the electrical grid that is powering whatever device you're watching this on right now is one of the stranger and more beautiful threads in all of human history. By the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, the Roman Empire's appetite for amber had reached remarkable proportions. The Roman author Pliny the Elder, whose encyclopedic work on natural history is one of the most extraordinary documents from the ancient world, described amber as so fashionable among wealthy Romans that even a small amber figurine was worth more than a healthy enslaved person. He described one Roman rider sent to the Baltic coast to procure amber for the Emperor Nero's gladiatorial games, returning with so much of the material that the nets strung around the arena to protect spectators were decorated with amber pieces, as were the weapons and armour of the fighters themselves. The largest single piece he brought back weighed more than 4 kilograms. 4 kilograms. That is roughly the weight of a large dictionary, of a single piece of fossilised tree resin from a Baltic beach. What I find striking about this is not the extravagance. Roman extravagance is well documented and consistently staggering. What strikes me is what it reveals about the supply chain that was quietly operating behind all of it. Delivering kilograms of amber to Rome consistently enough to decorate an entire amphitheatre required a functioning commercial network operating across thousands of kilometres of pre-Roman Europe. It required traders along the Vistula Alpine guides, Adriatic merchants, all working their sections of a route that nobody had formally organised, but that functioned for practical purposes as reliably as a modern supply chain. And then the Roman Empire fell. The Western Empire collapsed in 476 of the Common Era, and with it the reliable demand from the Mediterranean that had driven 5 centuries of intensive amber trade largely disappeared. The routes went quiet, the warehouses emptied, but the amber kept washing up on the beaches. And eventually, as the medieval world slowly reorganized itself and long-distance trade began again, new buyers appeared. The Christian church had discovered amber, rosary beads, altar decorations, votive objects. The same amber that had decorated a Roman gladiator's armour now served the prayers of medieval Christians across Europe. The material changed hands and changed meaning and kept moving. By the 12th century, the trade was running again with enough volume that the crusading orders, the Teutonic Knights among them, recognized its strategic value and moved to control it. We will come back to that story later in our journey tonight because it has a darkness to it that deserves its own space. But for now, I want to leave you with this. Somewhere in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, resting in a climate-controlled case, is the reconstructed pectoral breastplate of the pharaoh Tutankhamun. Among the gold and turquoise and carnelian and lapis lazuli of the original construction there are beads of amber. Large, warm, amber-gold beads, tested by scientists, confirmed as Baltic in origin. A boy king buried with the treasure of his civilization, and in that treasure pieces of a Baltic beach, carried by unknown hands across unknown miles over an unknown number of years. That journey is not a footnote to history, it is the whole point. The cold, grey, overlooked northern shore of Europe was connected to the great civilizations of the ancient world not through conquest, not through colonization, but through the patient, persistent, essentially human act of trade, of wanting things that come from far away, of finding a way across every obstacle to get them there. The amber is still washing up on those beaches today. Every autumn storm, every high tide delivers more of it. The 55-million-year-old forest keeps paying out its treasure, one piece at a time, to whoever has the patience to wait for the storm to pass and walk down to the shore. Now, the people who walk those shores, who built their lives around these seas, who developed the boats, and the legal systems and the trade networks that made all of this possible, they are the real story. and the version of them that most of us carry in our heads is about as accurate as thinking electricity was invented by a piece of tree resin. It is time to meet who they actually were. All right. Before we go any further tonight, I need to ask you something. When you hear the word Viking, what do you picture? Be honest. I know what you picture, because I pictured the same thing for most of my life. A huge man, horned helmet, screaming at the top of his lungs, charging up a beach with an axe, burning something. Probably several things. And look, Hollywood made that image so vivid, so satisfying, so viscerally entertaining that it basically replaced actual history in our minds. The horned helmets alone, completely fictional by the way, a 19th century artistic invention that had absolutely nothing to do with real Norse warriors. Those helmets are now on coffee mugs, novelty socks and sports team logos across the United States. Here is the thing though. Here's the part that genuinely stopped me cold the first time I really sat with it. The story we've been told about the Vikings, the whole rampaging, burning, terrifying civilization story, covers maybe 5% of who they actually were, maybe less. And the other 95%, the actual daily life of the people who lived along those cold northern coasts, who woke up every morning under grey skies and made something remarkable out of almost nothing. That story is so much more interesting, and almost nobody tells it. So that is what we are doing right now. Let me take you somewhere. It is the early 9th century, somewhere around the year 800, and we are standing at the edge of a settlement on the southern coast of the Jutland Peninsula in what is today northern Germany. The place is called Hedeby, or Hythabu if you want the original name, and at this particular moment in history it is one of the most important, most cosmopolitan, most surprisingly civilized places in all of Northern Europe. I want you to hold that word, civilized, because we're going to completely rebuild what that word means by the time this part of our story is over. Hedeby sits at the narrowest point between the Baltic Sea and the North Sea, a crossing so strategically perfect that it almost seems designed by someone who understood exactly what they were doing. And the people who built their lives here absolutely did understand. Instead of sailing the long, dangerous route around the top of Denmark, merchants would unload their goods on one side, carry them overland a few miles, and reload them on the other side. Hedeby was the shortcut that connected two worlds. At its height, somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 people lived there. Archaeological excavations and historians have been digging here seriously since the early 20th century have uncovered a town laid out in proper streets with wooden plank walkways to keep people's feet out of the mud. Workshops for craftsmen, smiths, jewellers, comb makers working with antler bone, a harbour complex, evidence of long-distance trade goods arriving from places as far away as the Byzantine Empire in the southeast England in the west, and the far northern Arctic in the other direction entirely. This was not a camp. This was not a temporary raiding base. This was a functioning city. Built by the same people history has spent 1,000 years describing primarily as destroyers. And here is where I want to pause, because I think this is actually one of the more important things we can notice about how history gets written and remembered. The raids were real. I am not going to stand here and pretend Viking raids on monasteries and coastal towns did not happen, because they absolutely did. They were genuinely terrifying for the people who experienced them. The monks at Lindisfarne in northeast England, whose monastery was struck in the year 793, were not exaggerating when they described the event with horror. That was a real horror. But here is the critical thing: the people who wrote those accounts were the people who were attacked. And they wrote about the attackers. They did not write about the thousands of Norse families who never left home, who spent their entire lives farming small plots of land, fishing, raising animals, raising children, and trying to keep warm through brutally long winters. Those people did not make it into the historical record because nothing dramatically terrible happened to anyone famous because of them. I find myself thinking about this a lot when I read history. The loudest stories are almost never the most representative ones. In reality, the overwhelming majority of people living along the Norse coasts of the Baltic and North Sea during the Viking Age, roughly the late 8th century through the early 11th century, were farmers. Ordinary, hard-working, exhausted farmers. They grew barley and rye in soils that were not particularly generous. They kept cattle, sheep, and goats. They supplemented everything with fish because the sea was right there and fish were reliable in a way that harvests sometimes were not. Now, can I tell you the detail about Vikings that genuinely makes people at dinner parties stare at me like I've just said something impossible? Vikings bathed more regularly than almost anyone else in medieval Europe. I know. Take a second with that. In Old Norse, Saturday was called Lugadag, washing day. Once a week as a cultural habit, Norse people bathed, they combed their hair, they groomed themselves. Archaeological sites across Scandinavia and at settlements like Hedeby and Birka, another extraordinary Norse trading town near what is today Stockholm, have yielded enormous quantities of combs, razors, ear cleaners and tweezers. Personal grooming tools buried as valued possessions because they were valued possessions. There are even accounts from English and French sources written by people who were not particularly fans of the Norse, complaining that Norse men were so well groomed and so particular about their appearance that local women found them attractive. One English chronicler from the 11th century essentially wrote a complaint that Danish men were stealing English women's attention by bathing too much and combing their hair too carefully. That is, in my opinion, one of the greatest footnotes in all of medieval history. But let us go a little deeper, because the physical daily life of these coastal communities was shaped by something even more interesting than hygiene habits. It was shaped by a legal and social structure that is genuinely surprising when you look at it closely. Norse society had the thing, written out as Thing. It was an assembly, a gathering of free people, where disputes were settled, laws were made, and decisions that affected the community were argued out in public. Every free man had the right to speak. Every free man had the right to bring a case. The thing met regularly on a schedule at a known location. Now, this was not democracy in the way we understand it today. Women and enslaved people were largely excluded, and the weight of your voice in the assembly depended heavily on your social standing and how many allies showed up with you. Let us be clear-eyed about that, but compare it to the contemporary system in most of medieval Europe, where a lord's word was simply law, and there was no formal mechanism for a common person to challenge it publicly, and the Norse thing looks remarkably progressive. Decisions were supposed to be reached by consensus, not just by force of personality or title. The assembly was where a king or chieftain had to come and make his case just like everyone else. The famous Icelandic parliament, the Althing, which was established in the year 930, grew directly out of this tradition. It is often cited as one of the oldest continuously operating parliaments in the world. The Althing still exists today. Iceland's parliament still carries that name. Think about that lineage. A form of public assembly born on cold Norse beaches over 1,000 years ago, still functioning in the 21st century. That is not the legacy of a people who are only good at burning things. Now I want to tell you about what a longhouse actually felt like. Because if you close your eyes and imagine a Viking home, you might picture something brutal and dark. And parts of it were. Let us be honest. The longhouse was exactly what it sounds like. Long low, often built partially into a hillside for insulation, with walls of wood or turf or stone depending on what was locally available. The roof was thatched. There were no windows in most of them because windows let in cold air, and cold was the enemy. The centre of the longhouse had a long fire pit running almost the full length of the building. That fire never went out if the family could help it, because starting a fire from scratch with flint and tinder in a Norwegian winter was not the kind of task you wanted to repeat unnecessarily. Smoke from the fire drifted upward and out through a small opening in the roof theoretically. In practice, a longhouse in winter was full of a permanent low haze of wood smoke that settled into everything hair, clothes, skin, food. Everyone who lived in one smelled of smoke all the time. Historians who have studied the health of Norse populations note that respiratory problems were genuinely common, and that the average lifespan, while we should be careful about medieval mortality statistics because infant deaths skew, the numbers dramatically was considerably shorter than we enjoy today. And yet, people cooked elaborate meals in these smoky spaces, not just porridge and dried fish, though those were certainly staples. We have evidence from archaeological plant and animal remains of a diet that included dairy products, wild berries, cultivated vegetables, occasional game, and seasonal fruits. Feasts, real feasts, not just more porridge, happened regularly and were taken seriously as social occasions. The sharing of food in Norse culture carried significant meaning. Hospitality was a moral value, not just a nice gesture. Ask yourself, and I genuinely mean this as a question, not just a rhetorical one, how different is that really from the way we use food today? The big family meal as a statement of care. The table as a place where community is reaffirmed. We carried that with us all the way from smoky Norse longhouses into our modern dining rooms. Most of us just do not know the distance the tradition travelled. There is one more thing I want to leave you with before we move forward. The word Viking itself. Most historians today believe it comes from the Old Norse word vik, meaning a small bay or inlet. A Vikinger with the R on the end that marks it as a noun was essentially someone who lurked in or departed from a bay. Someone who worked the waters of a cove, not a warrior, not a berserker, a person defined at the root of the word by their relationship to a particular kind of geography, coastal people, bay people, people whose entire world was organized around the curve of a shoreline and the depth of the water just offshore, and when you sit with that, when you let that original meaning settle in, the whole picture shifts. Because it turns out that Viking was never really about violence at its core. It was about water, about the relationship between people and the sea that was simultaneously their greatest resource, their highway, their food supply, and their most constant threat. Which brings us naturally to the people who knew that sea better than almost anyone, the people who did not raid it, who did not sail dramatically away from it on longships toward distant horizons, the ones who stayed, who got up before dawn every single morning and did the most unglamorous, most essential, most genuinely dangerous work that these northern coasts ever produced, the fishermen. And what they pulled from those grey, unforgiving waters, and what it eventually did to the entire economy of Europe, is a story that will make you look at a fish in a completely different way for the rest of your life. Let's keep going. Picture this. It is somewhere around the year 1200. The sun has not risen yet, and in northern Europe in the colder months that means it will not rise for another 3 or 4 hours. The world outside is black and cold, and the kind of quiet that feels almost physical, like something pressing gently against your ears. And somewhere along the coast, maybe on the flat, windswept shores of what is today the Netherlands, or on the rocky Danish coastline, or along the grey mudflats of northern Germany, a man is already awake. He has been awake for a while. He dressed in the dark, ate whatever was left from the night before, and walked down to the water's edge in the last hours before dawn. Not because he is particularly excited about his morning, but because the tide waits for nobody and neither does the sea, and if you want to eat this week, if you want your children to eat this week, you go when the water tells you to go. He is a fisherman, and his life is one of the most physically demanding, economically precarious, spiritually complicated, and historically underestimated lives in all of medieval Europe, We talk a lot about kings and merchants and warriors when we talk about the coasts of the Baltic and North Sea, and those people matter. They do, but they were the exception. For every merchant growing wealthy on Hanseatic trade routes, for every chieftain holding court in a great hall, there were hundreds of men and women whose entire relationship with these waters was more elemental than that, more personal, more daily. The fishermen were the ones who knew the sea in their bones, not as a highway to somewhere else, not as a boundary between kingdoms, as a place where you went to do the hardest work of your life every single day, with tools that were simpler than you might imagine, and with risks that were very, very real. Let me give you some numbers that help put this in perspective. The North Sea, in terms of weather, is genuinely one of the more unforgiving bodies of water in the world. Storms can develop faster there than almost anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere. Conditions can shift from calm to violent in a matter of hours. Medieval fishing boats, which were small, open or semi-open, wooden vessels, had essentially no protection from those conditions beyond whatever the fisherman himself could provide through skill and experience. Historical maritime records, and we have quite a few from various coastal regions dating back to the 12th and 13th centuries, suggest that in bad years, losses among fishing communities could be staggering. Entire crews, entire boats, not once in a generation, but with a regularity that these communities simply built into their understanding of what life meant. And yet they went, every morning when the conditions allowed it, because they had no real alternative. Now, here is the part of this story that I find genuinely fascinating, and that almost never makes it into the popular imagination. What were they actually fishing for? If you ask most people that question, they will shrug and say, fish, maybe cod, maybe something. And cod is part of the answer. Cod fisheries in the North Sea and around Iceland were enormously important, and we will come back to that. But the fish that truly powered the medieval economy of the Baltic and North Sea coasts, the fish that was so critical, so universally needed, so strategically valuable, that wars were literally fought over the fishing rights to it, was herring. Small, silver, oily, abundant. Herring. I know that is not the dramatic answer anyone expects, but follow the logic for just a moment and I promise it pays off. Medieval Europe was a deeply Christian continent, and medieval Christianity had a very specific relationship with food. Specifically, the Church had established somewhere between 100 and 150 days per year, depending on the particular tradition and region on which eating meat was forbidden. Fridays, the 40 days of Lent, various saints' days throughout the calendar. On those days, fish was the permitted protein. Fish was not a luxury. Fish was a requirement. And the population of Europe, which by the 13th century had climbed to somewhere around 70 million people, needed an enormous, reliable, affordable supply of it. Herring was the answer. Herring moved in schools so dense that contemporary sources described them as darkening the water, almost impossible to believe now, given how thoroughly those populations have been depleted by centuries of overfishing. But in the medieval period, herring was genuinely astonishingly abundant in the Baltic and along parts of the North Sea, and crucially, herring could be preserved. Salted and packed in barrels, herring could survive months of storage and travel hundreds of miles inland to feed people who never saw the sea in their lives. This made the fishermen who caught herring, and the merchants who distributed it, some of the most economically essential people in all of medieval Europe. It also made the herring fishery a target for anyone with the power to control it. The great herring fairs of Scania, the southern tip of the Scandinavian peninsula, in what is today Sweden, are one of those historical events that I think deserve far more attention than they usually get. Every late summer and autumn from roughly the 12th through the 15th century the herring arrived. They came in numbers that are almost incomprehensible by modern standards. schooling so thickly in the shallow waters of the Öresund, the strait between Denmark and Sweden, that accounts from the period describe men being able to catch them with their bare hands or with baskets simply lowered into the water. And when the herring came, so did everyone else. Fishermen from the Baltic coast, from the North Sea, from the Norwegian fjords. Salt merchants from Lübeck, because you needed enormous quantities of salt to preserve the catch. Barrel makers, because you needed somewhere to put it all. Merchants from dozens of different cities and countries, all converging on this one stretch of coastline to trade, negotiate, argue, and make fortunes. At its height, the Scania fairs were one of the largest trade gatherings in all of Northern Europe. The sheer volume of human activity concentrated in that one place seasonally year after year helped drive the development of trade practices, legal norms, and commercial relationships that shaped the entire Baltic economy. The Hanseatic League, which we're going to spend considerable time with a little later in our story, built significant portions of its early power on controlling the herring trade coming out of Scania, the fish, the salt, the barrels, the shipping, the banking credit to finance it all of it ultimately traceable back to those silver schools of herring turning in the cold autumn water. But I want to come back to our fisherman, standing on the shore before dawn, because there is a human dimension to this story that the economics alone do not capture. He would have a set of superstitions so specific, so detailed, and so seriously observed that to our modern eyes they look almost like a second religion layered on top of whatever official faith he nominally practiced. Many coastal fishing communities had strict rules about what words you could and could not say before going out to sea. In some traditions along the North Sea coast, certain animals, hares, rabbits, and in some areas cats were considered deeply unlucky omens if you happened to encounter them on your way to the boat. Meeting a woman on the path to the water in the early morning was in some communities considered a bad sign. Meeting a minister or a priest could be even worse. If any of these things happened, some fishermen would simply turn around and go home accepting a lost day rather than risk the consequences. Does this sound irrational to us now? Probably. But put yourself in that position for just a moment. You're about to get into a small wooden boat in the North Sea in the dark in November, with the full knowledge that not everyone who goes out comes back. If the community wisdom that has accumulated across generations, that has encoded imperfectly but meaningfully the collective anxiety of hundreds of years of loss, tells you that certain signs are bad signs, you take them seriously. You take them seriously because you cannot afford not to. There is something I find genuinely moving about that. The way fear becomes ritual, becomes culture, becomes something that holds a community together in the face of what it cannot control. The actual mechanics of the work are worth understanding too, because they tell you something about the kind of intelligence these men and women developed. Medieval North Sea fishermen did not have compasses for most of this period. Regular compass use in northern European vessels came later than most people assume, well into the 13th and 14th centuries for many smaller operations. Instead, they navigated by something older and more tactile, the lead line, a lead weight attached to a long rope marked with measurements dropped over the side of the boat. The depth of the water told you where you were. The North Sea and Baltic are shallow enough, averaging less than 90 meters for much of their area, that experienced fishermen could literally read their position from the seabed. They knew which depths corresponded to which stretches of coast. They knew what the bottom felt like. The lead line was sometimes coated in tallow grease so that particles of sand or shell from the seabed would stick to it on the way up, and those particles told you things. Fine sand here, gravel there, shell fragments in this particular spot that meant you were over a bank known for good catches. This was knowledge that took years to accumulate and could not be written down in any useful form. It lived in the hands and the memory. It passed from father to son, from boat captain to apprentice in the darkness of a pre-dawn departure. when an experienced fisherman died without passing on his knowledge, that knowledge simply disappeared. Gone. A library lost without a fire. Think about how much of what we consider skill in the modern world is actually like that. Embedded in practice, in proximity, in years of accumulated attention to things that nobody thought to document, because they seemed too obvious. We lost entire archives worth of knowledge about these seas when those traditions broke down. One more thing before we move forward. The split of the catch. In most medieval fishing operations along the northern coasts, the boat, the nets, and the equipment were owned by someone, either the fisherman himself, if he was prosperous enough, or more often a wealthier townsman or merchant who had invested in the outfit. The men who crewed the boat received a share of the catch rather than a wage. The boat owner took his portion. The crew divided the rest according to a formula that varied by region and by tradition. This sounds simple, but what it meant in practice was that a fisherman's income was almost entirely dependent on factors completely outside his control. A bad season, whether because the herring simply did not show up, or because weather kept the boats in harbour for weeks at a time, or because a competitor from another port arrived with better nets and got there first, could mean genuine hardship. Not inconvenience, hardship of the kind that thinned children and shortened lives, and in a good season the money was real. It could be transformative. A spectacular herring season in the right location at the right time could generate enough income to change a family's circumstances for years. So the life swung between those poles year after year. Precarity and possibility in almost equal measure, which is, now that I think about it, not so different from a great many lives being lived right now in the 21st century by people who work on commission, or in volatile industries, or in places where a single bad year can undo a decade of progress. Some things about the human condition travel through time better than longships. Now, here is where it gets genuinely extraordinary, because everything we have just talked about, the herring, the salt, the barrels, the fairs, the entire infrastructure of preserving and distributing fish across a continent, all of it was about to be transformed by one man's small, unglamorous, quietly revolutionary idea. One fisherman in the 14th century figured out a slightly better way to gut and salt a herring, and that tiny technical improvement so small, it barely sounds like a historical event set off a chain reaction that would make one nation the wealthiest place on earth. The fish, the salt, the money, the empire that nobody saw coming. That is exactly where we are headed next. There is a village in the southwest of the Netherlands called Beervliet. It is a small place today. Quiet, modest, the kind of town you would drive through without stopping if you did not know what happened there. But in Beervliet there is a stained glass window in a church, and in that window a man stands holding a herring in one hand and a small curved knife in the other. He wears the colours of the Dutch flag, orange, blue and white. His name, according to the inscription, is Willem Bokelsoen, and the story attached to his image is one of the most consequential stories in the economic history of Northern Europe. Whether it is entirely true is, as it turns out, a more interesting question than it first appears. The story goes like this. Sometime around the year 1380, history being, as one Dutch historian delightfully wrote, rather vague, on the point a fisherman from Beervliet noticed something that other fishermen had been missing or ignoring. When you gut a herring in the usual way, removing all the organs, the fish preserves reasonably well in salt. But if you remove only the gills and part of the gullet and leave the pancreas intact, something different happens. The enzymes in that remaining organ, specifically a compound called trypsin, continue working inside the salted fish, and instead of the flesh simply sitting preserved in brine, it slowly ripens. It becomes softer, more complex in flavour, and it keeps far, far longer than ordinarily gutted herring. The technique was called jibbing, in Dutch kaken, and according to the legend it was Willem Bokelsoen who figured it out. Now, I want to tell you something that makes this story even more interesting. Modern historians who have dug carefully into the records have found essentially no firm documentation that any specific Willem Boykelsoen invented this technique. There were several men by that name living in Zealand in the 14th century. Which one, if any, was the great innovator is impossible to say with certainty, and the jibbing technique itself almost certainly originated in Sweden, where similar methods had been practiced for some time before the Dutch are credited with discovering it. So is the whole story a myth? Not exactly. And here is why I think the historical complexity makes the story more interesting, not less. The important thing is not whether one man named Willem in one specific year made one specific cut in one specific fish. The important thing is the cascade of consequences that followed from the widespread adoption and refinement of this technique in the Dutch fishing industry. Whether it came from Zealand or Sweden, whether it was one man's invention, or a gradual collective development, the Dutch took it, perfected it, and built an empire on it. And in 1556, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V actually visited the grave of Willem Boykelsoen in Beervliet to pay his personal respects. The most powerful ruler in the Western world paying tribute at the tomb of a fisherman. If that image does not tell you something about how seriously the Dutch took the economic significance of this moment, nothing will. Here is where the story shifts from interesting to genuinely remarkable. Because the jibbing technique itself was only half of what made the Dutch herring industry revolutionary. The other half was a single, simple and brilliant operational decision. They stopped bringing the fish back to shore to process it. This sounds obvious in retrospect, but for most of the history of North Sea fishing, the process worked like this. You went out, caught fish, came back to port as fast as possible, and the processing, the gutting, salting and barrelling happened on land. This meant your range was severely limited by the time it took fish to stay fresh on the journey home. You could only fish so far from your home port before the catch was compromised. The Dutch broke that constraint entirely, starting in the late 14th century and accelerating through the 15th. Dutch and Flemish fishermen began doing the jibbing and salting directly on the boat while still at sea. The crew gutted the fish the moment they came out of the net, salted and packed them in barrels before the boat moved on to the next net. By the time the vessel turned back toward port, its hold was full of finished market-ready preserved herring that could survive months of transport and storage. This meant the Dutch could sail past the coastal fishing grounds their competitors were limited to push north along the Scottish coast, past the Shetland Islands, into the deep, cold waters of the open North Sea, and beyond waters so rich in herring that contemporary accounts describe the schools as stretching for miles, and they could stay there for weeks at a time, only returning when the hold was full. The vessel built to make this possible was called the herring bus, and it was in the most literal sense a floating factory, wide-hulled for stability in North Sea swells, designed with a specific internal layout that allowed efficient onboard processing, crewed by somewhere between 18 and 30 men whose work was divided between fishing and the assembly line processing of the catch. At the fishery's peak in the early 17th century, estimates placed the Dutch herring bus fleet at somewhere around 500 vessels, some sources going as high as 2,000 if you count the full range of support ships. Together at their most productive, these vessels were pulling roughly 33,000 metric tons of herring out of the North Sea every year. Think about that scale for a moment. 33,000 metric tons of a single fish every single year, from a nation roughly the size of West Virginia. There were also specialized fast boats called ventjagers, which translates roughly as sail hunters, whose entire purpose was to race the first barrels of the season back to market before anyone else. Because in the herring trade, as in many commodity markets, being first often meant getting the best price. Speed was money. and the Dutch had engineered speed into every part of their supply chain. But here is the element of this story that gets almost no attention, and that I think is the actual key to understanding how a fish transformed an entire civilization. Salt, everything, the gibbing, the onboard processing, the long preservation times, the ability to ship herring across Europe, every bit of it depended on massive, continuous, reliable supplies of good quality salt. And the Dutch, living in a cool, wet climate with no natural salt deposits of any significance, did not have it, so they went and got it. Beginning in the 15th century, Dutch ships were making regular voyages all the way to Portugal, and later to the Cape Verde Islands and the coast of France specifically to load salt. The Dutch salt trade became in itself a significant commercial operation. And here is the chain reaction that nobody talks about in popular history when a Dutch merchant ship sailed south to load salt for the herring industry. It needed something to carry on the outward journey, so it loaded Baltic grain, rye and wheat from the fields of Prussia and Poland, which it had brought west from the Baltic on a previous voyage. The salt ships went south loaded with grain. They came back loaded with salt. The salt went into barrels for herring. The herring went across Europe. The money came back to Amsterdam. The Dutch were not just fishing. They were managing a multi-commodity, multi-directional logistics system of extraordinary sophistication. The herring was the motor that turned the whole engine. But the engine itself connected the Baltic Sea, the North Sea, the Atlantic coast of Europe, and eventually the entire globe. By the mid-16th century, something had happened in the Netherlands that astonished every other nation in Europe that was paying attention. A region that a century earlier had been described by outside observers as economically modest, a patchwork of marshland and fishing villages with no obvious natural advantages, had become fabulously confusingly wealthy. The canals of Amsterdam were lined with merchant houses that announced their owners' fortunes in brick and stone and gable ornamentation. Dutch art was entering what would become one of the most extraordinary flowerings of painting in human history. Rembrandt and Vermeer were still a generation away, but the wealth that would commission them was already accumulating. Dutch merchants were financing voyages not just around the North Sea, but around Africa to India, to what would become Indonesia and Brazil and Manhattan. And when you asked a serious economist in the 17th century where all this wealth began, the answer was not exotic spices or colonial extraction or military conquest. The Dutch East India Company, the trading corporation that historians often cite as the first publicly traded joint stock company in history, founded in 1602, was a consequence of Dutch wealth, not a cause of it. Before the spice trade, before the colonial empire, before the stock exchange, there was herring. A Dutch statesman of the period, commenting on the foundation of his nation's prosperity, used a phrase that has stayed with historians ever since. He described Amsterdam as a city built on herring bones. He was being slightly poetic. He was not being inaccurate. Now, I want to be honest with you about something because I think it matters when we tell these stories. The Dutch herring dominance did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in direct competition with the Hanseatic League, which had controlled Baltic and North Sea trade for 2 centuries before the Dutch arrived with better ships, more efficient operations, and a willingness to undercut established prices. The League had its own herring operations, its own salt trade relationships, its own grip on the Scanian fishing grounds that we touched on earlier. And the Dutch systematically dismantled that grip year by year through sheer commercial efficiency. By the early 16th century, Dutch ships were entering the Baltic in numbers that the Hanseatic League found genuinely alarming. They were offering lower transport costs, faster turnaround, and more flexible commercial terms than the old Hanseatic network could match. The League's response, and this will become important when we look at its eventual decline, was a combination of political lobbying, attempted embargoes, and the kind of institutional defensiveness that organizations tend to display when they sense something they cannot quite name threatening something they cannot quite protect. The Dutch were not going to stop. Because they had figured out something that the Hanseatic League, for all its centuries of commercial sophistication, had not yet fully grasped. The future of trade was not about controlling specific routes, or specific goods, or specific relationships. It was about being cheaper, faster, and more adaptable than anyone else in the market. It was about operational efficiency as a competitive strategy. The herring bus was not just a boat. It was a proof of concept for an entirely different way of thinking about commerce. And the ship that took that proof of concept to its logical extreme came a little later in 1595. A merchant from the Dutch town of Hoorn named Pieter Jansz Leon refined the design of a vessel that would come to be known as the Vloot. Wide in the hull for maximum cargo, narrow on the deck, and this detail is almost too perfect specifically to minimise the tolls levied by the Danish crown on ships passing through the Sound between Denmark and Sweden into the Baltic, which were calculated based on deck size. The Dutch literally redesigned their ships to fit through a toll booth more cheaply. The Vloot required a smaller crew than comparable vessels of the time, lower operating costs per ton of cargo, no wasted space on armaments, purely ruthlessly beautifully optimized for commercial efficiency. When the Dutch fleet of flights entered the Baltic trade routes that the Hanseatic League had dominated for 400 years, it was not a battle. It was barely a competition. The Dutch simply cost less to operate. And in commerce, as in most things, that is usually the end of the argument. I think about Willem Bokelzoon sometimes, whoever he actually was, this probable fisherman from a small village in Zealand, who may or may not have made a particular cut in a particular fish on a particular autumn day in the 1400s. Whether the legend is literally true or whether it is a kind of folk memory of a more gradual collective innovation, it encodes something real about how transformation works. It does not always announce itself. It does not always begin with kings or armies or grand declarations. Sometimes it begins with a fisherman noticing something, with a knife held differently, with a small enzyme in a fish pancreas doing its quiet work inside a salted barrel. And then given enough time and enough people willing to follow the logic of the thing wherever it leads, it builds a city on herring bones. It finances a golden age. It changes the world. Which brings us at last to the organisation that both preceded Dutch commercial dominance and was ultimately overtaken by it. The organisation that in its own way had already built something just as extraordinary, not on one innovation, or one fish, or one nation's ambition, but on an entirely different and deeply human principle. The principle that enough people agreeing on enough shared rules can build a kind of power that no single king can easily match. They had no army, no treasury, no leader, no territory, and they ran Northern Europe for 400 years. Something has been sitting in the back of my mind since we started this journey tonight, and I think it is finally time to say it out loud. We've talked about fishermen risking everything before dawn. We've talked about amber travelling thousands of miles to rest on a pharaoh's chest. We have talked about Norse communities building something genuinely sophisticated out of cold air and stubbornness. And underneath all of it, running like a quiet current beneath every story we have told, there has been this recurring question. How do ordinary people in difficult places with no central authority telling them what to do build something that changes the entire world? The answer, it turns out, looks like this. Imagine you are a merchant in the city of Lübeck in the year 1241. You've been trading goods along the Baltic coast for years, timber furs, beeswax, grain, and you are good at it. But every journey is its own separate gamble. Pirates operate openly in the Baltic because nobody has enough consistent power to stop them. Tolls accumulate on every river route like barnacles on a hull. Local lords impose whatever fees they feel like imposing, and if you complain, the only person you're complaining to is the same lord who just took your money. The roads are dangerous, the sea is dangerous, and the legal protections available to a travelling merchant in most of Northern Europe amount to roughly nothing. You need allies, not an army. You cannot afford an army, not a king. There is no king who covers all the territory you operate in. What you need is something more flexible than either of those things, something horizontal rather than vertical, a network of people who share your problems and your interests, bound not by oath of fealty to a single ruler, but by the much more practical glue of mutual benefit. So in April of 1241, the representatives of two cities, Lübeck and Hamburg, sit down and sign an agreement, a pact of mutual protection and commercial cooperation along the trade routes connecting the Baltic Sea and the North Sea. It does not have a grand name yet. It does not have a constitution, or a headquarters, or a flag. It is just two cities deciding that they are stronger together than apart. But that small, pragmatic, almost boring agreement is the seed from which something extraordinary grows. The organization that eventually develops from that seed becomes known as the Hanseatic League. And I want to be careful here because the word league might make you picture something formal and structured with committees and headquarters and an official seal. The Hanseatic League had some of those things eventually, but its genius, the actual reason it worked for as long as it did, was precisely how informal it remained at its core. There was no permanent administrative body for most of its history, no common treasury, no standing military force, no single leader with the authority to compel any member city to do anything. Membership was voluntary. Cities joined because it served their interests, and in theory at least they could leave when it stopped serving their interests. The entire thing operated on consensus, on shared commercial norms, on a collective reputation that every member city had a stake in protecting. I find this genuinely remarkable every time I think about it. We are talking about an organization that at its height in the 15th century encompassed somewhere between 170 and 200 cities, cities as far apart as London in the west, Novgorod in the east, Bergen in the north, and Cologne in the south. An organization spanning multiple kingdoms, multiple languages, multiple legal systems, and it held together for over 400 years, not through force, but through the sheer convincing logic of the benefits it delivered. No army, no king, 400 years. So how did it actually work? The heart of the system was the contour, a word that simply means trading post or counting house. The Hanseatic League established 4 major contours in cities that were not themselves League members, but were strategically critical to the network. In London, the contour was known as the Steel Yard. Not because anyone was making steel there, the name comes from an Old English word related to a weighing device used for measuring goods. The Steelyard sat on the north bank of the Thames, roughly where Cannon Street Station stands today, and it operated as an almost completely autonomous community within the City of London. Hanseatic merchants living there had their own warehouses, their own hall, their own scales and weights, and an extraordinary package of trading privileges granted by the English Crown in exchange for the commercial activity they brought. They were exempt from most of the tolls that English merchants paid. They had their own legal jurisdiction for disputes among themselves. They were in a meaningful sense a city within a city, a piece of Lübeck planted in the middle of London. In Bergen on the western coast of Norway, the Konter controlled the dried cod trade that was absolutely essential for feeding inland Europe during the long months when fresh food was scarce. In Bruges, in what is today Belgium, the Kontor sat at the heart of the Flemish cloth trade that made medieval Flanders one of the wealthiest regions on the continent. And in Novgorod, in what is today Russia, The contour tapped into the vast resources of the eastern lands, furs, wax, leather, forest products that flowed westward through the Baltic network. Each contour was staffed by Hanseatic merchants who lived there for extended periods, often years at a time under strict regulations about behaviour and commercial practice. They were not supposed to marry local women, for example, not because of any particular hostility to locals, but because the League was deeply concerned about members developing conflicting loyalties. You were a Hanseatic merchant first. Your commercial identity was collective. That was the deal. Now, I want to tell you about a moment that more than almost any other illustrates just how much power this organisation had quietly accumulated. In the year 1361, the King of Denmark, Valdemar IV, a man with an extremely high opinion of himself and a correspondingly low opinion of other people's property rights, decided to seize the island of Gotland and its main city Visby. Visby was one of the oldest and most important trading hubs in the entire Baltic, and Hanseatic merchants had significant interests there. Valdemar essentially walked in, took it, and then followed that by shutting down Hanseatic access to the crucial fishing waters off the Scanian coast. The League's initial response was the commercial equivalent of a very cold stare. They imposed a trade embargo on Denmark, stopped sending goods, stopped moving ships through Danish waters, essentially tried to strangle the Danish economy through economic pressure. It did not work immediately, partly because some non-Hanseatic merchants kept trading with Denmark, undercutting the embargo. So the League escalated. They assembled a naval fleet, member cities contributing ships according to their size and resources, and in 1362 they went to war. Actual war. With a king. Led by the mayor of Lübeck, a man named Johan Wittenborg, who sailed out with the combined fleet to challenge the Danish crown on the open water. The first campaign did not go as well as hoped. Wittenborg was captured, and the League, in a detail that says a great deal about how seriously they took failure, actually executed their own commander when he returned home. Not for cowardice, for incompetence and unauthorized negotiation. The message was clear: the standards here are high, and they apply to everyone. But the League did not stop. They reorganized, rebuilt the coalition, and came back. By 1370, after years of pressure, military, economic, diplomatic, they forced Denmark to sign the Treaty of Stralsund. And what the League extracted from that treaty is breathtaking in its ambition. Not just trading rights restored, not just compensation for losses. The Hanseatic League negotiated the right to veto who could become the next King of Denmark. Actual political veto power over the succession of a sovereign kingdom. A network of merchants with no king of their own sitting across the table from an actual monarch and telling him that they would decide who sat on his throne after he was gone. That is not a trade organization anymore. That is a superpower. And yet here is the thing that I think gets lost in all the geopolitical drama. The Hanseatic League's real power was never primarily military. It was informational and logistical. The network meant that a merchant in Lübeck had access to price information from a dozen different markets simultaneously. He knew what wool was selling for in London, what the demand for rye looked like in Riga, whether the herring catch in Scania was good or poor this season. In a world where most people operated with extremely limited information about conditions even 100 miles away, this was an almost unfair advantage. The Hanseatic network was in a real sense the medieval equivalent of having the internet when everyone else was still sending letters by horseback. They also standardized things that had previously been chaotic: weights and measures, contract law, the practices around credit and debt which allowed merchants to conduct large-scale trade without physically transporting gold everywhere they went. These are the kinds of boring procedural administrative innovations that do not make for exciting stories, but that are absolutely foundational to anything we would recognize as a modern economy. The historian Philippe Dollinger, who wrote the definitive scholarly study of the Hanseatic League in the 20th century, described it as a forerunner of the European Union, both in its structure as a voluntary confederation of states and in its fundamental argument that shared commercial standards and free movement of goods serve everyone better than fragmented competing systems. I think that framing is exactly right, and I would add one more comparison that Dollinger did not make because it would have been impossible in his time. The Hanseatic League also looks in certain lights remarkably like the model that Silicon Valley eventually reinvented in the 20th century. A network of independent actors loosely affiliated competing with each other in some domains, while cooperating fiercely in others. A shared infrastructure that benefits everyone who operates within it. An informal culture with powerful norms that discipline members more effectively than any formal legal system could. Reputation as the primary currency. The details are completely different. The underlying structure is eerily similar. There is one more element of Hanseatic life that I cannot leave out, because it is so specific and so strange and so perfectly illustrative of how seriously these people took their collective enterprise. In the larger contour communities, Bergen is the best documented. The young merchants who came to work and learn the trade lived under conditions that would feel oppressive by almost any modern standard. They were not allowed to leave the contour compound after dark. They were not allowed to maintain personal relationships with local people. They were subjected to hazing rituals when they arrived that ranged from uncomfortable to genuinely unpleasant, and they had very little recourse if they found the conditions difficult. The entire system was designed to produce a particular kind of person, disciplined, commercially focused, loyal to the collective, above personal comfort, and deeply embedded in the norms and practices of the Hanseatic community. Now, was that a good way to treat young men? Probably not by any standard most of us would apply today. I am not going to romanticize it. But it produced something. It produced a coherent commercial culture that could operate consistently across dozens of cities and hundreds of years without a bureaucracy to enforce it. The values were not written in a rule book somewhere that someone checked. They were installed in people through years of living inside a community that modelled and enforced them, which raises a question I find genuinely interesting, and I would love to know what you think about it. Leave it in the comments if you feel like it. Is that how most lasting cultures actually work? Not through official rules, but through immersion, repetition, and social pressure applied young enough to become instinct? Because if it is, then the Hanseatic League did not just build a trade network. It built a civilization in miniature with its own values and its own way of forming the people who would carry those values forward. That is a bigger thing than moving barrels of herring. That is a genuinely big thing. And the cities that housed all of this, the physical places where these merchants lived, worked, argued, and built, those cities were extraordinary in their own right. Walking into Lübeck or Riga or Tallinn in the height of the Hanseatic era was not like walking into a rough medieval trading post. It was like walking into something that was, by the standards of its time, genuinely beautiful, genuinely designed, genuinely meant to last. The architecture alone tells you everything about how the League understood itself, and that is exactly where we are going next. Because the buildings these merchants left behind are still standing. Some of them are still standing right now tonight on those same coasts we have been talking about all evening. And they have things to tell us about what daily life inside the walls of a Hanseatic city actually felt like. What you ate, what you wore, what you were afraid of, and what you were proud of. Come with me inside the walls. Step inside for a moment. Not metaphorically, literally. Close your eyes if you want and walk with me through the gate. We are standing at the western entrance to Lübeck sometime in the middle of the 15th century, the height of Hanseatic power, the period when this city carried the unofficial but universally acknowledged title of Queen of the Hansa. The gate we're walking through is the Holstein Tor. It is still standing today, still in the same spot on the same ground, those twin round towers leaning very slightly toward each other, because the marshy soil underneath has been settling for 6 centuries. Brick. Dark red brick laid in intricate patterns rising maybe 30 metres above the road. The inscription carved into the stone above the entrance reads in Latin Concordia Domi Foris Pax, harmony within, peace without. That was the ideal, the aspiration carved in stone at the city's threshold, and whether or not the reality always matched the ideal, which it never entirely did because human beings are involved, the fact that they chose to write it, there tells you something about how these people understood themselves and what they were trying to build. The first thing that would strike a visitor arriving in Lübeck in the 15th century was the skyline. 7 church spires, rising above the surrounding rooftops in a jagged Gothic crown against the Baltic sky. 5 churches, 7 spires, all of them built from the same dark red brick that everything in this city was built from, because the flat northern German plain had no useful building stone anywhere nearby. The architects who were hired to build churches and merchant houses worthy of the wealthiest trading city in northern Europe had to work with what the land provided, and what the land provided was clay, so they fired brick, and they fired it and stacked it and vaulted it and buttressed it until they had created something that should not by any reasonable architectural logic have been possible in that material. The vaulted nave of St. Mary's Church in Lübeck, the mother church of an architectural style that would spread to over 70 daughter churches across the Baltic coast, holds the distinction of being the highest brick vaulted ceiling in the world. Not the highest vaulted ceiling full stop. The highest brick vaulted ceiling, built by people who had no stone, working within the constraints of a material that was supposed to be second best, and producing something that no one has ever surpassed. I find that deeply satisfying in a way I can't fully explain. The city that had no natural advantages, no stone, no noble pedigree, no ancient history of empire, looked at what it had and built the highest vaults in the world from it. But let's come back down from the spires, because the street level of a Hanseatic city is where the actual life happened, and it was considerably more interesting and more complicated than the grand ecclesiastical architecture suggests. Walk with me down Breite Strasse Broad Street, the main commercial artery of Lübeck, running roughly north to south through the island of the Old Town. The houses here are merchant houses, and they have a specific architectural logic that is worth understanding because it tells you everything about how these people organized their lives and their work. A typical prosperous Hanseatic merchant's house from the 15th century was tall and narrow property, was at a premium in a city surrounded by water, and every metre of street frontage was valuable. The facade facing the street was the public face of the enterprise, imposing, decorated with carved brick details, and stepped gables that announced the owner's wealth and taste. Behind the facade the house ran deep. The ground floor at street level was workspace, storage for goods, counting rooms, the practical infrastructure of commerce. The family living quarters were above on the upper floors, away from the noise and smell and constant traffic of commercial life below, and behind the main structure accessible through a passage was the courtyard, the garden, the additional storage, sometimes a separate building for apprentices or household staff. The physical organisation of the house embodied the Hanseatic worldview in miniature: business in front, life above, everything in its proper place, clearly delineated, efficiently arranged. Now, what did those merchants actually do all day? The morning in a Hanseatic merchant's household began early, before the city's bells rang the working hours in many cases. Correspondence was the lifeblood of the network, and a successful merchant in Lübeck might have ongoing commercial relationships with partners in Novgorod, in London, in Bergen, in Bruges, all of whom needed regular updates on prices, on shipping conditions, on political developments, that might affect trade routes. Letters were dictated or written by hand, sealed with wax, and dispatched with whatever ship was leaving for the relevant direction that day or that week. We actually have many of these letters surviving in archives, and reading them is a strange, intimate experience because the voice that comes through is so recognizable across 6 centuries. Careful merchants checking facts before committing to positions, frustrated merchants complaining about partners who did not respond quickly enough, anxious merchants watching political situations develop in ways that might threaten their investments. The specific commodities and routes change. The human texture of commercial anxiety is identical. After the morning correspondence, the merchant's day moved to the market and the harbour. Lübeck's position on the Treves River connected to both the Baltic and the overland routes running south and west, meant that on any given day a variety of goods might be arriving or departing. Bolts of Flemish cloth, barrels of salt from Lüneburg. The salt warehouses, the Salzspeicher, still stand along the Trave today. 6 stepped gable brick buildings that stored the commodity that underwrote everything. Bundles of fur from the eastern Baltic. Barrels of herring we have already spent considerable time with. Timber, wax, amber. A successful merchant needed to track all of it simultaneously, to know which ship captain was reliable and which was not, to understand the credit situation of every partner in the network, to anticipate seasonal price movements and position accordingly, to manage a web of obligations, favours and long-standing relationships that was simultaneously the League's greatest strength and its most demanding requirement. There was no office in the modern sense. There was no separation between the merchant's commercial life and his personal life, because they were essentially the same life. His social relationships were his commercial relationships. His family reputation was his credit rating. The social life of a Hanseatic city was organised around the Rathaus, the town hall. Lübeck's Rathaus has been operating continuously since 1230. 9 centuries of civic government in the same building. The wine cellars beneath it have been serving the city council since medieval times. The council that governed these cities was composed of the wealthiest merchant families, a self-perpetuating oligarchy, if you want to use the modern term, and that is not entirely unfair. Power resided with the families that had accumulated the most capital over the most generations. New money was accepted eventually but slowly. Old money was deeply comfortable with its position and in no hurry to share it. This meant that Hanseatic city governance was simultaneously more meritocratic and more oligarchic than feudal alternatives. More meritocratic because the basic criterion for power was commercial success, which was at least theoretically open to talent and hard work. More oligarchic because success tended to entrench itself and become self-reinforcing across generations. The great merchant dynasties of Lübeck families like the Möllers, the Verendorps, the Kochs, appear again and again in the commercial and political records across multiple centuries. They were not nobility in the feudal sense, but they had invented their own version of aristocracy built on ledger books rather than land grants. Thomas Mann, the Lübeck-born novelist who won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1929, spent his greatest novel Buddenbrooks chronicling precisely this world. The slow arc of a Hanseatic merchant dynasty, across 4 generations, the accumulation of wealth, the crystallization of values, the eventual exhaustion of commercial vitality as culture and refinement, replaced the hungry ambition of the founders. He was drawing directly from his own family history and his own city's memory. The book is fiction, but every serious historian of the Hanseatic period recognizes it as one of the most accurate portraits of what that world actually felt like from the inside. Can I tell you about marzipan for just a moment? Because it is one of my favourite small details in this entire story. Lübeck is today one of the world's most famous producers of marzipan, the sweet almond paste confection that the city has been making for centuries and still exports across Europe. You can buy it shaped into fruits, vegetables, miniature pigs, elaborate sculptures. It is a serious local industry and a source of genuine civic pride. The origin of marzipan in Lübeck is genuinely debated. There are competing claims from various German and Italian cities. But one plausible and widely discussed theory is that Hanseatic merchants brought the recipe from Moorish Spain or the Arab world through the trade networks that connected the League's western outpost to the Mediterranean, which means there is a reasonable possibility that the sweet most associated with a wealthy northern European trading city arrived there via the same networks that carried cloth and herring and timber. That it is in some sense a small edible remnant of the extraordinary reach of the Hanseatic commercial world, an almond paste that travelled from Arab kitchens to Spanish markets to Flemish merchants to the counting houses of Lübeck, and is now being sold in tourist shops to Americans and Japanese and Brazilians who have no idea they are eating something, whose arrival in their hands required centuries of interconnection. That is the Hanseatic legacy in miniature, baked into a small pink pig. Not everyone in these cities lived in a tall merchant house on Breiterstrasse, of course, and I want to make sure we do not leave this section with only the view from the prosperous top. Lübeck's old town, even at the height of its wealth, had a significant population of craftsmen, labourers, domestic servants, and the chronically poor. The city addressed, at least partially in its own way, the problem of poverty with an institution that deserves a moment of recognition. The Hospital of the Holy Spirit was built in 1286, financed by wealthy merchants who apparently understood that a functioning city required something beyond commercial infrastructure. It provided housing and care for the old, the sick, and those who could not support themselves. One of the oldest operating social welfare institutions in all of Europe, still there today, still caring for elderly people in some capacity 6 centuries later. What I find interesting about this is the funding model. This was not charity from a king or a religious institution mandated by the church. It was merchants' people who had built their entire worldview around commercial calculation, deciding that the city they lived in needed this thing and paying for it. Whether this was genuine compassion or enlightened self-interest in maintaining a stable community, or simple civic pride, or all three at once, I genuinely cannot say. But the building has been standing and functioning for 740 years. Whatever motivated it, it worked. There were also in Lübeck's residential alleys approximately 180 of them, running off the main streets and leading to tucked-away courtyard residences, the homes of people who could not afford street frontage, but who had found a way to live within the city's protection nonetheless. About half of these alley systems still survive today, their small brick cottages and cobbled courtyards, now among the most sought-after real estate in the city. 600 years ago, they were the working-class neighbourhoods of the Hanseatic world. The people who lived there, the rope makers, the barrel makers, the dock workers, the women who processed fish and wove cloth and cooked and washed and maintained the entire domestic infrastructure on which commercial life depended, they are harder to find in the historical record. Their names appear occasionally in court documents, in parish records, in the accounts of the guilds that regulated their trades. But they do not leave behind correspondence and commercial ledgers the way the great merchant families do. There is one more space in this city I want to take you to before we move on, because it captures something about the Hanseatic world that all the commercial statistics in the world cannot quite convey. Go back to St. Mary's Church. Stand inside under those improbable brick vaults. Look up at the astronomical clock on the north wall. It was installed in 1405 and still functions today, still marking the hours and the planetary positions with the same mechanism that a medieval clockmaker assembled over 600 years ago. On the hour, small mechanical figures emerge and process around a track. The figures represent the apostles. They march past a figure of Christ who blesses them each in turn. This is a clock built by and for merchants, people who organize their entire lives around precise time, the departure of ships, the opening of markets, the deadlines of commercial contracts. And they commissioned a mechanism that tracked not just hours, but the movements of planets, not just the commercial calendar, but the sacred one. They built something simultaneously practical and magnificent, functional and beautiful, rooted in commercial necessity, and reaching towards something they could not put a price on. That is the Hanseatic world in a single object, counting the hours, watching the heavens, blessing what passes beneath. And the people who moved through these spaces, who lived in the alley cottages and the merchant houses, who worshipped under the brick vaults and bargained at the market stalls, they were not simply the commercial actors that the ledger books record. They were full human beings with families, fears, ambitions, and in some cases an extraordinary degree of agency that the standard historical narrative of this period rarely credits them with. Because when we look carefully at who was actually running things in these Hanseatic households, who kept the accounts when the merchant travelled, who managed the relationships, who made the decisions that kept the commercial enterprise alive, across the long months when the men of the house were away on voyages that could last half a year, we find something that I think will genuinely surprise you. And that is exactly where we're going next. There is a particular kind of erasure that happens so slowly, so quietly, that most people never notice it happening. It is not like burning a library. It does not announce itself. It happens one omission at a time, a name left out of a chronicle, a role described as belonging to a husband, when the records actually show it was the wife, a legal right that existed for centuries, but that nobody thought important enough to mention, because it seemed at the time simply ordinary. And then enough time passes, and the ordinary becomes invisible, and the invisible becomes forgotten, and eventually someone writes a history book and half the people who actually lived through the history are simply not in it. Tonight I want to put some of them back. Let me ask you something before we go further. When you try to picture a woman living along the Baltic or North Sea coast in, say, the 10th or 11th century, what do you see? Be honest with yourself for a moment. I think most of us, if we are being truthful, default to a very particular image. A woman at a loom. A woman tending a fire. A woman waiting for the men to come home from the sea or the raid or the trading voyage. Patient. Domestic. Peripheral to the actual story. That image is not entirely false. Domestic work, the weaving, the food production, the management of a household's resources was absolutely real, and it was genuinely demanding, and it was how a large portion of women in these communities spent much of their time. But it is maybe 20% of the actual picture, and the 80% that gets left out is what I find remarkable. Start with the law. Because the law tells you what a society actually believes about people underneath all the stories it tells itself. In the legal codes of medieval Norse society, and we have actual written records of these codes, particularly from Iceland, where the legal tradition was meticulously documented in a body of law called the Gragas, compiled in the 12th and 13th centuries, but reflecting practices that were considerably older. A woman had rights that her contemporaries in France, England, or the Holy Roman Empire simply did not possess. A Norse woman could own property in her own name, not in trust, not administered by a male guardian, not contingent on her marital status. In her own name. A Norse woman could initiate divorce, not just accept one or be subject to one, initiate one. The grounds did not need to be extraordinary, persistent neglect, failure to provide certain personal conduct she found unacceptable. There are saga accounts of women publicly announcing a divorce before witnesses, which was the legal procedure, and walking away with their own property intact. A Norse woman whose husband died did not automatically fall under the authority of the nearest male relative. She became in legal terms a fully autonomous person, able to manage estates, conduct business, enter contracts, and make decisions about her own household without requiring a man's signature or approval. Now, I want to be careful not to paint this as a medieval feminist paradise, because it was not. The Thing assembly, as we discussed earlier, was dominated by men. Social pressure was real. Violence against women existed and was not always adequately addressed by the legal system. The rights on paper did not always match the experience of living. But here is the thing. The gap between the legal reality of a Norse woman's life and the legal reality of a woman's life in most of the rest of medieval Europe was not small. It was vast. It was the difference between being a legal person and being in many frameworks, essentially a legal dependent of whatever man was nearest. And the question worth asking is why? Why those coasts? I have my own theory about this, and I acknowledge it is a theory, not a settled historical fact. But I think it comes back to the same thing that shaped everything else about these northern coastal communities. The environment was demanding enough that competence mattered more than convention. When your husband is at sea for months, whether fishing or trading or on a long voyage, and you are running a farm, managing livestock, preserving food for winter, making decisions about resources, handling disputes with neighbours, potentially defending the property, you cannot afford to be legally invisible. The community cannot afford for you to be legally invisible, because the community needs you to be functional, to be authoritative, to be capable of acting without waiting for a man to come home and tell you what to do. Necessity again doing what ideology rarely manages, creating a form of practical equality, not because anyone sat down and decided equality was a value worth enshrining, but because the alternative was simply too expensive. Now, I need to tell you about a grave. In the Swedish town of Birka, the same important Norse trading settlement we touched on earlier in our story, on an island in Lake Mälaren near what is today Stockholm, archaeologists in the late 19th century excavated what they identified as a warrior's grave. Burial chamber, BJ 581 as it is recorded in the academic literature. The grave was exceptionally well appointed. 2 horses, a full set of weapons, sword, axe, spear, armor-piercing arrows, a battle knife. A gaming set which historians interpret as evidence of someone who was expected to plan and strategize, a marker of command, not just combat participation. Everything about the burial suggested a person of high military status. For over 100 years, archaeologists assumed without much question that this was a man. The weapons, the horses, the military equipment, the assumption was so automatic that it was barely examined. Then in 2017, a team of researchers conducted ancient genetic analysis on the skeletal remains. The results were unambiguous. The person buried in that grave with the weapons and the horses and the gaming set, and all the markers of high military status, was biologically female. The academic debate that followed was, to put it gently, spirited. Some scholars pushed back hard, suggesting alternative explanations. Maybe the grave goods belonged to a previous burial and were mixed in accidentally. Maybe the burial was symbolic rather than literal. Maybe this did not mean what it appeared to mean. The debate is genuinely ongoing in academic circles, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that. But the physical evidence is what it is, and it sits alongside other archaeological finds, women buried with weapons in various sites across Scandinavia, and the saga literature that describes women who took up weapons and fighting roles, the so-called skjaldmær or shield maidens, and together they suggest something that the standard narrative of Norse women simply sitting by the fire does not accommodate. The coastal world of the Norse was more complicated, more varied, more interesting than the version most of us inherited, Let me shift now from the Norse world to the Hanseatic world, because the story of women in Hanseatic port cities is a completely different chapter, and it is one that I find genuinely moving in a different way. The official Hanseatic merchant class was male. The guilds, the trading privileges, the political representation within the contour system, all formally male. If you had asked a Hanseatic merchant in the 15th century whether women participated in long-distance trade, he might have given you a look of polite confusion, and then he might have gone home to let his wife handle the accounts. Because what actually happened in Hanseatic households, and we know this from surviving account books, legal records and correspondence, particularly from the cities of Lübeck and Hamburg, was considerably more complicated than the formal structure suggested. Merchant wives were deeply involved in the commercial operations of their households, not as passive assistants, but as active participants who understood the business, maintained relationships with clients and suppliers, and in many cases made significant decisions independently, while their husbands were away on trading voyages that could last months or years at a time. There are surviving letters from the 13th and 14th centuries, actual correspondence, not later accounts, in which wives of Hanseatic merchants write to business partners with full authority, negotiating terms, managing payments, handling disputes. Not apologetically, not with a note explaining that their husband would confirm everything when he returned. Just directly, as someone who knows what they are doing and expects to be treated accordingly. And when a Hanseatic merchant died, something remarkable often happened. His widow did not step back from the business. She ran it. There is a formal term that appears in the legal and commercial records of Hanseatic cities, the widow as a recognized commercial entity able to trade under the family name and maintain the family's trading privileges in her own right. In Hamburg, legal records show women operating as independent merchants, not under a husband's name, not in a secondary capacity, but as principal traders with their own commercial standing. One remarkable category that historians have identified in the records of several Baltic port cities is women trading specifically in amber and luxury goods, operating in the same networks, and sometimes the same marketplaces as their male counterparts. The records do not always highlight this, because to the people keeping the records it was apparently not unusual enough to require special comment. Ordinary. Again, the ordinary that becomes invisible over time. There is something I want to dwell on for just a moment, because I think it matters beyond the historical facts themselves. We have this tendency, and I notice it in myself too, so I am not pointing fingers to assume that progress is linear. That equality is something we invented recently, and are gradually extending backward through history, like a light being turned on in a dark room. Past equals dark, present equals light. The arrow of time moves in one direction, but the women of the Norse coasts and the Hanseatic cities complicate that story considerably. Not because medieval Northern Europe was some kind of paradise of gender equality, I've already said it was not, but because the specific conditions of these specific places produce specific forms of autonomy and legal recognition that then got partially lost, not extended, lost. As the more hierarchical, more rigidly patriarchal structures of later centuries consolidated and spread northward, and absorbed these coastal cultures into their frameworks. Progress is not linear. Rights that exist can disappear. Ordinary arrangements that a community takes for granted can become extraordinary, and then impossible within a generation or two if the conditions that made them possible change. That is a lesson with an edge on it, if you want to find one. And I think the women of these northern coasts would have found something wry to say about it if anyone had thought to ask them. Which brings me to one last woman I want to mention tonight, because she is, in my opinion, one of the most remarkable human beings in all of medieval European history, and she almost never appears in the popular imagination of this period. Her name was Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir. She was born in Iceland around the year 975 or 980. She travelled to Greenland as a young woman. She crossed to North America to the place the Norse called Vinland in what is today Newfoundland in Canada, where she gave birth to a son named Snorri, making him very likely the first European child born in the Americas. She survived that voyage and returned, and then later in her life she made a pilgrimage to Rome, walking or travelling by ship and on foot from the North Atlantic coast of Iceland all the way to Rome. The same woman, Iceland to North America, and then to Rome in the 11th century. The sources that record her life, primarily the Vinland sagas, treat her as remarkable but not impossible. Because in the world she came from, she was not impossible. She was extraordinary, but she was built from the same material as the women around her: the legal independence, the expectation of competence, the coastal culture that had always required its women to be full participants in the life of the community. She could not have been Gudrid anywhere. She could only have been Gudrid there on those particular coasts in that particular world. And that world, for all its autonomy, for all its resilience, for all the extraordinary people it produced, was also a world that lived constantly in the shadow of something it could not control, could not negotiate with, could not impress with competence or legal standing or sheer human determination: the sea itself. Because the same waters that gave these communities everything, their food, their trade, their connections, their identity, also had the capacity to take everything back in a single night, without warning, without mercy. And the story of what those northern seas could do when they decided to remind these coastal people exactly who was in charge, that story is one of the most sobering, most human, and most strangely beautiful chapters in everything we have covered tonight. It is coming up right now. There is a town at the bottom of the North Sea, not a ruined town, not an abandoned town, a drowned one, gone completely, swallowed so thoroughly and so finally that for several centuries after it disappeared, people were not entirely sure it had ever existed at all. Its memory survived only in fragments, a name mentioned in church records, a few coins turning up in fishermen's nets, a local legend that some dismissed as pure mythology. The sort of story that gets told on dark winter evenings when the wind is loud and the firelight is low about a city of sinners who defied the sea one time too many and paid for it. The city was called Rungholt, and what happened to it on the night of January the 16th, 1362, is one of the most dramatic and sobering episodes in the entire history of the northern coasts. To understand that night, you need to understand what had been happening along the North Sea coast for the 2 centuries before it. Beginning roughly in the 11th and 12th centuries, a wave of settlers moved into the wide coastal marshes of what is today the border region of northern Germany and Denmark, a flat, fog-prone landscape where the land and the sea have always negotiated an uneasy truce. These were Frisian people, practical and resourceful, who recognized that the rich, silty marshland, if you could protect it from tidal flooding, was extraordinarily fertile. They built earthen dikes, modest ones by later standards. Historical reconstructions suggest they stood perhaps 2.5 meters above normal sea level. Just enough. Just barely enough. Behind those dikes they drained the marshes and farmed them, and here is where the first quiet catastrophe began so slowly that nobody noticed it happening. The marshland they were draining was partly peat, and when you drain peat, it compresses, it shrinks, the ground level drops. Year by year, almost imperceptibly, the land they had reclaimed was sinking, while the sea outside their dikes remained exactly where it was. By the early 14th century, in some areas of the Frisian coastline, the ground behind the dikes had sunk below the level of the sea outside them. The dikes were not protecting low-lying land from flooding. They were in some places the only thing standing between inhabited communities and water that was higher than the ground they were living on. The people living there did not fully understand this. Or perhaps some of them did and simply had nowhere else to go. The marshland was their home. The dikes had held for generations. The sea had been fierce before and the dikes had held. And then came the night when they did not. A chronicle written some years after the event describes the storm arriving, with northwesterly winds so violent that trees, mills and church towers were flattened across England and the North Sea coast simultaneously. A new moon coincided with an extreme spring tide, the combination that produces the highest possible water levels under normal conditions. Then the storm drove that already elevated sea ahead of it, piling water against the low coastlines, with a force that the medieval dike systems were simply not built to resist. The dikes broke. In some places the water came in gently, a seeping inexorable rise that gave people hours to flee to higher ground with what they could carry. In other places, particularly on the loose, sandy and peaty soil of the Frisian outer islands, the ground did not just flood, it gave way. Entire sections of coastline slid into the sea as the soft material beneath them saturated and collapsed. Rungholt, a prosperous trading town of perhaps 1,500 to 2,000 inhabitants, that had been shipping cattle to markets in Flanders and the Low Countries, occupied exactly this kind of ground. By the morning of January the 17th it was gone. Not damaged, not partially flooded. Gone. The sea floor where it had stood became tidal flat, and it has remained tidal flat ever since. Across the entire coastline the count of what's lost that night is staggering, even at its most conservative estimate. At least 25,000 people dead. Some historical accounts suggest numbers approaching 100,000, though that figure is almost certainly an exaggeration. 30 to 40 villages erased completely, 42 parishes in the North Frisia region documented in church records as having simply disappeared. The coastline of what is today the German state of Schleswig-Holstein was permanently redrawn. Bays that had not previously existed were carved out of the mainland. Islands that had previously been connected to each other were separated. The North Frisian Islands as they exist today, Siltfur Amrum and the small Hallig Islands, are in significant part the geological inheritance of a single night storm in January of 1362. The medieval name for the event was De Grote Mandrenke, the Great Drowning of Men. Now, I want to sit with something here because I think it demands more than just a description of the disaster. The people along these coasts knew floods. This was not the first catastrophe of this kind. A nearly identical storm surge in 1219 on the same calendar date, the feast day of St. Marcellus, January the 16th, had killed an estimated 36,000 people along the coasts of what is today the Netherlands. The date was remembered. The anniversary was marked. Communities told their children what had happened. And then they rebuilt. They stayed. They went back. Why would anyone do that? Why would a community that had seen its neighbours drowned its land, destroyed its geography, permanently altered, why would it choose to remain on that same vulnerable coastline, under that same precarious arrangement, with the same capricious sea? I have thought about this question a great deal, and I do not think the answer is simply that people had nowhere else to go, though that was certainly true for some. I think it is something more complicated and more human than that. I think it is the psychology of communities that have organized their entire identity, their economy, their relationships, and their understanding of the world around a specific place, and for whom leaving that place would mean not just physical displacement, but a kind of death of the self. The sea had given everything. The sea had taken everything. And then this is the part that moves me most: the sea gave back. After the flood, the Frisians did not simply try to rebuild what they had. They built differently, better. The new dike construction that followed the 1362 catastrophe was fundamentally redesigned higher, wider, built on different principles that acknowledged what the old dikes had failed to understand about the relationship between their weight and the soft ground beneath them. The disaster became engineering knowledge. The grief became adaptation. A community that could absorb that level of loss and come back with improved infrastructure is not simply stubbornly refusing to learn. It is demonstrating a particular kind of intelligence, the intelligence of people who know that the environment will not change to accommodate them, and that their only option is to understand it more precisely and prepare more thoroughly. But the sea was not the only thing these coastal communities had to fear in the 14th century, because something else was travelling the trade routes at exactly the same time, moving faster in some ways than any cargo ship because it had no need of wind or tide. The Black Death arrived in Europe in October of 1347, when 12 Genoese trading ships docked at the Sicilian port of Messina after a journey from the ports of the Black Sea. The port authorities who came to meet the ships found most of the sailors dead, and the survivors covered in black suppurating swellings that announced a disease no one on the European side of the Mediterranean had encountered in living memory. The ships were ordered out of the harbour immediately. It was far too late. What those ships carried, rats and fleas infested with the bacterium Yersinia pestis, dispersed faster than any quarantine order could contain. Within weeks, the disease was moving through Sicily. Within months, it was in mainland Italy. Within a year, it had crossed the Alps and was advancing northward through France, Germany, and eventually England. By the year 1350, it reached Scandinavia and the Baltic coast. Here is the detail that I cannot let pass without comment. The Black Death travelled along trade routes. It moved precisely through the network of ports, river connections, and commercial relationships that the Hanseatic League had spent 2 centuries building and perfecting. The same infrastructure that carried herring from the Baltic to Flanders and cloth from England to Riga. These same ships, the same harbour facilities, the same pattern of regular contact between cities, also carried the plague, efficiently, thoroughly, with the same reliable speed that made it the envy of every competing commercial system. No one has ever accused the Hanseatic merchants of being reckless or careless. They were, if anything, almost obsessively attentive to risk. But no commercial risk management system of the 14th century had any framework for what was happening, because nothing like it had happened in European memory. The disease killed between 30 and 50% of the people it reached in most affected areas. In some cities, the mortality was higher. Florence lost roughly half its population. Paris was burying hundreds of dead each day at the peak of the epidemic. The Baltic and North Sea coasts were not spared. The plague moved through the Hanseatic cities with the same indifference it showed everywhere else. Lübeck was hit. Hamburg was hit. Riga, Tallinn, Gdansk, all hit. The population losses disrupted trade, left warehouses understaffed, created labour shortages that paradoxically improved conditions for surviving workers in the decades afterward, and left behind a collective psychological scar that shaped European culture for generations. What I find particularly striking about the northern coasts in this period is what the combination of flood and plague coming within 15 years of each other actually produced in terms of community response. Because there is a small detail from the plague's history that emerged from precisely this part of the world, or rather from a trading city on the Adriatic that was deeply connected to the Baltic trading network, that deserves far more attention than it usually receives. The city of Ragusa today, called Dubrovnik on the Dalmatian coast of what is now Croatia, was a significant trading partner of several Hanseatic cities. When the plague began moving through the region, the city government of Ragusa made a decision that was at the time completely unprecedented. They required all ships arriving from infected areas to anchor at a distance from the harbour for 30 days before anyone came ashore. 30 days of enforced isolation. If no one developed symptoms in that time, the ship could dock. The practice was later extended to 40 days. In Italian, 40 is quaranta. The practice became known as quarantina. We still use the word today in its anglicised form, quarantine. The entire global practice of disease isolation that became one of the most powerful tools of public health in human history traces its name and its conceptual origin to a Dalmatian port city's pragmatic response to a crisis in the 1400s. A crisis that travelled to that port on ships from the same trade network that connected the Baltic shore to the rest of the known world. I want to ask you something, and I mean this genuinely. When you think about the communities that went through all of this, the Grote Mandrenke, the plague, the ordinary grinding hardship of fishing and farming in a demanding climate, do you see fragility? Do you see people defined by what broke them? Or do you see something else? Because I see something else. I see communities that developed out of absolute necessity, a relationship with catastrophe that is almost philosophical in its maturity. They did not pretend the catastrophe would not come. They did not build their emotional and cultural life around the pretense of safety. They built it around a clear-eyed acknowledgement of vulnerability, and they invested their energy in understanding the mechanisms of disaster, in building better dikes, in developing quarantine practices, in creating mutual aid networks that could absorb loss without dissolving the community. There is a Low German phrase that North Frisian communities kept in their folklore long after the Grote Mandrenke. It translates roughly as the sea takes and the sea gives, and neither the taking nor the giving follows any law we were made to understand. It is not a despairing phrase. It is an honest one. It does not ask the sea to be fair. It simply acknowledges the terms of the arrangement and gets on with the business of living within them. That seems to me like wisdom. The kind of wisdom that does not come from books or philosophy, but from generations of standing at the edge of something larger than you and choosing to stay. The 14th century, all things considered, was not kind to the people of the northern coasts. Flood, plague, the slow erosion of the Hanseatic commercial order that had given many of these communities their structure and their prosperity. And yet in the second half of that same brutal century, something else was already well underway along the eastern Baltic shore, something that had begun more than a century earlier, and that had been reshaping the spiritual, political, and daily lives of the people there in ways that were in some respects even more profound than any storm surge. It had come not from the sea but from the south and the west, with banners and blades and a cross stitched on a white mantle, and the people who received it, who had been living their own spiritual lives in their sacred groves and beside their sacred fires for thousands of years before anyone told them they were doing it wrong, had a great deal to say about that arrival. Not all of it, unfortunately, was heard. Something worth sitting with before we go any further. We have spent this entire journey talking about people who are defined by the sea, by the rhythms of tide and storm, by the amber washing onto their beaches, by the herring runs and the trading routes, and the extraordinary civilizations they built from cold air and stubborn determination. And through all of it, underneath the commerce and the politics and the architecture, there was always something else, a set of beliefs, a way of understanding the world that had nothing to do with the God that the rest of Europe was praying to. Because the Baltic coast was the last place in Europe where the old ways survived. Not the last place by a few years, by centuries. While the rest of Western and Central Europe had been officially Christian since the 4th, 5th, 6th century, the people living along the eastern Baltic shores were still doing something entirely different. Something older. Something rooted in the forests and the rivers and the amber-coloured sea itself. And then the men with crosses on their cloaks arrived. And the world along these northern shores changed forever in ways that were far more complicated, far more morally difficult, and far more interesting than the word conversion usually suggests. Let me tell you first about what those old ways actually looked like. because I think they deserve more than a footnote. The indigenous peoples of the eastern Baltic coast, the old Prussians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians, the Estonians, each had their own distinct traditions, but they shared a broadly similar spiritual framework. Nature was not background. It was the thing itself. Sacred groves existed throughout the Baltic landscape, specific trees, specific clearings, specific hillsides where the divine was understood to be most present. Cutting down a sacred oak without ritual acknowledgement was not simply impolite. It was a transgression against the fabric of the world. Fire held a central place in Baltic religious life. In Lithuania and in the territories of the old Prussians, sacred flames were maintained by dedicated priests and priestesses' flames that were never allowed to go out tended continuously as expressions of divine presence in the community. The sanctuary of Remuva in Old Prussian territory was described by medieval chroniclers as a remarkable place. A great sacred oak hung with cloths and offerings, a perpetual fire burning at its base, priests who interpreted signs and mediated between the human world and something older and larger. There was also something that strikes me as particularly beautiful, and I realize beauty is my word and my perspective, so take it for what it is. In Lithuanian folk tradition, the grass snake, the jolties, was considered a sacred household guardian. Families kept them, fed them milk, regarded their presence as a blessing. You could still find traces of this belief in rural Lithuanian households into the 20th century. That is how deep some of these roots went. Christianity arrived officially in Lithuania in the year 1387, and the snake in the kitchen persisted for another 500 years. Now, how did Christianity actually come to the Baltic coast? In most of the stories we tell about the Christianization of Europe, there is at least a veneer of voluntary conversion. A king accepts baptism. His people follow. The faith spreads through persuasion, through mission work, through the personal charisma of individual evangelists. It is complicated and messy and rarely as peaceful as the official version suggests, but there is at least a story about ideas travelling between willing people. In the Baltic, for large stretches of this history, there was not even that pretense. In the year 1171, Pope Alexander III authorized a crusade specifically targeting the pagan peoples of the eastern Baltic. The stated purpose was conversion. The actual mechanism was military conquest. And for the next 2.5 centuries, a series of campaigns, the Northern Crusades, as historians call them, swept through the Baltic coast with an agenda that combined genuine religious motivation with something considerably less spiritual. The organization that came to dominate these campaigns was the Teutonic Order. Founded around the year 1190 during the Third Crusade in the Holy Land, these were monk knightsmen who had taken religious vows but organized themselves as a military force. When their work in the Middle East became less viable, they pivoted, and in 1226, when a Polish duke named Conrad I of Masovia invited them to help subdue the pagan Old Prussians on his northeastern border, they had found their new purpose. The conquest of Prussia that followed took more than 50 years of almost continuous warfare. The Old Prussians resisted with remarkable tenacity. They launched major uprisings in 1242 and again in 1260 that nearly expelled the order entirely. Individual episodes of the war were genuinely terrible on both sides, but the Teutonic Knights had resources, castle-building technology, and a steady supply of crusading reinforcements arriving from across Western Europe. Ambitious European noblemen who wanted the spiritual credit of a crusade without the expense and distance of travelling to the Holy Land could make the much shorter journey to the Baltic instead and fight pagans there. The Pope had declared it spiritually equivalent. By the late 13th century, the Old Prussians as a distinct people had been effectively destroyed, killed, displaced, absorbed into the German-speaking settler population that moved into the newly conquered territories behind the crusading armies. Their language, a Baltic language related to Lithuanian and Latvian, disappeared entirely by the early 18th century. Today we know it only from a handful of surviving vocabulary lists and 2 short catechism translations. A language spoken by human beings for thousands of years gone without a trace. I think about that sometimes. The total loss of a way of speaking and therefore a way of thinking dissolved within a few generations of military defeat. But here is the piece of this story that I want you to really hold for a moment, because it gets to the heart of something important about how power works and how power disguises itself. Many serious historians who have studied the Northern Crusades in depth have noted something uncomfortable in the record. The Teutonic Knights were frequently accused not by their enemies, but by church officials and even other crusaders of slaughtering already baptized Christians, destroying secular churches, actively impeding conversion efforts when those conversions might reduce the legal justification for continued military operations, and trading commercially with the very pagan communities they were supposedly crusading against. Read that again. Trading with the pagans they claimed to be converting, because the pagans had goods that were valuable and the commercial relationships were profitable. One medieval account states plainly that many pagan communities in the Baltic interior specifically resisted Christian conversion, not because they had deep theological objections to Christianity, but because they had seen what life looked like under Teutonic administration, and they wanted no part of it. They were not rejecting a faith. They were rejecting a regime. That distinction matters. It matters enormously. And I think it is one of the most honest things I can tell you about this entire period. And nowhere does the gap between religious mission and economic reality become more visible than in the story of amber. Back at the very beginning of our journey tonight, we talked about amber as the first great export of the Baltic coast, the ancient trade, the fossilized gold that reached Egypt and Troy and Rome across thousands of years and thousands of miles. By the medieval period, that trade was still enormously valuable. Amber was used in rosary beads, in luxury decorative objects, in the kind of high-status goods that the wealthy across Europe desired. The Teutonic Knights understood this perfectly. In the year 1264, a formal agreement was reached under which all lands along the Baltic coast known to produce amber were transferred to the control of the Teutonic Order. The Archbishop of Sambia received 1/3 of all collected amber. The knights kept the rest. And in exchange for this arrangement, something quite extraordinary was decided. Any person found collecting amber on the beaches without authorization from the order, any local person, any ordinary man or woman simply doing what their ancestors had done on those same beaches for 5,000 years would be executed. Not fined, not imprisoned, executed. There was actually an official position created in Königsberg, the city the Teutonic Knights had founded in 1255, and named in honor of King Ottokar II of Bohemia, the city that exists today as Kaliningrad in Russia, specifically to enforce this monopoly. An officer whose duties included carrying out death sentences for unauthorized amber collection. Think about that for a moment. The same beaches where Bronze Age traders had gathered amber for 4,000 years. The same golden stones that had been washed up by storms for longer than human memory reaches. And now picking one up could get you killed. That is not conversion. That is not a religious mission. That is economic colonialism wearing a cross. And yet, and this is the part that always reminds me that history refuses to be simple, Königsberg itself became something genuinely remarkable. The city founded on conquest and amber gold eventually became one of the great intellectual centers of the Baltic world. The Albertina University was established there in 1544. The philosopher Immanuel Kant was born and spent his entire life there. The mathematician David Hilbert studied there. The city that began as a crusader fortress ended as a home to some of the most important thinkers in the history of European thought. I am not sure what to do with that except to notice it. That places built through terrible means can become over centuries something their founders never intended. That the ground under a university library does not remember the reason the city was built, but the ideas produced there persist regardless. The Teutonic Knights, for all their military and economic power, were not invincible. They had an appointment with humiliation that came on a specific day, in a specific field in what is today northern Poland. July the 15th, 1410. The Battle of Grunwald, also known as the First Battle of Tannenberg, brought together a combined Polish and Lithuanian force under King Władysław II Jagiełła and his cousin Grand Duke Vytautas. Against them stood the assembled military strength of the Teutonic Order, considered one of the finest heavy cavalry forces in Europe. The battle lasted most of the day, and when it was over, the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, Ulrich von Jungingen, was dead on the field. A significant portion of the Order's senior leadership was dead or captured. The Teutonic military power that had dominated the southern Baltic coast for nearly 2 centuries was shattered in a single afternoon. The Order survived in diminished form for another century, but it never fully recovered. The theocratic state that had been built through decades of crusading amber monopoly and economic dominance was cracked beyond repair at Grunwald, and the last great chapter of Baltic political history was beginning to be written not by knights, but by the merchants who had been building their own quiet empire in the meantime, and who are now facing their own very different kind of reckoning. Because empires built on trade are not brought down by a single battle, they die differently, more slowly, more interestingly, in ways that have a great deal to say to our own time, and that slow, complicated, surprisingly instructive story of endings that is exactly what we're going to sit with next. Let me set a scene for you. The year is 1669. The city is Lübeck, the same Lübeck that had once been called the Queen of the Hansa, the city whose name was synonymous with an entire civilization of commerce, the place where for 4 centuries the most powerful merchant network in the known world gathered to make decisions that moved kings. On a particular day in the spring of that year, representatives from member cities of the Hanseatic League arrived for what will be the organization's final formal assembly, the Hanseatic Diet. The gathering that had once drawn representatives from over 170 cities, from London to Novgorod, from Bergen to Krakow. The gathering that had once dictated terms to monarchs and blockaded entire kingdoms. 9 cities showed up. 9. Out of more than 200 that had once proudly carried the Hanseatic name. And after that meeting, which by all accounts was brief, subdued, and largely concerned with the practical question of what to do with the remaining shared assets, the Hanseatic League simply ceased to exist, not with a battle, not with a treaty forced upon it by a conquering enemy, not with fire or flood or plague. It ended with 9 cities in a room looking at each other and quietly acknowledging that the thing they had gathered to represent was already for all practical purposes gone. I find that image almost unbearably poignant, and I find it enormously instructive, because here is the question that I think this moment demands we ask, and I want you to really sit with it, not just let it slide past. How does an organization that spent over 400 years dominating the economy of Northern Europe, that humbled kings and built entire cities and created the commercial foundations of the modern world, how does something like that end not with a bang, but with 9 people in a room? The answer is not one thing. It is never one thing with institutions this large and this old. But the answer, when you pull it apart carefully, turns out to be a lesson so precise and so relevant that it should probably be taught in every business school and every government ministry and every place where people make decisions about power and organizations and the future. The Hanseatic League was not destroyed. It was made irrelevant. And there is a profound difference between those two things. Let us start with the thing that changed everything else. The thing that the League, for all its intelligence and all its adaptability, simply could not outrun. In the last decades of the 15th century and the opening decades of the 16th, the world got dramatically larger. Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean in 1492. Vasco da Gama rounded the southern tip of Africa and reached India in 1498. Within a generation, Spanish and Portuguese ships were carrying goods to and from places that had never appeared on any European map: the Americas, the East Indies, the coast of West Africa. The entire economic geometry of the world shifted. For the Hanseatic League, this was not immediately catastrophic. The League operated in the North Sea and Baltic, and the new Atlantic trade routes were far away. But what the Age of Discovery did slowly, inexorably, was relocate the centre of European economic gravity. The Mediterranean, which had already been declining relative to the northern seas, faded further. The Baltic, which had been the heart of Europe's most valuable trade network for centuries, began to look more like a regional backwater compared to the vast new currents of Atlantic commerce. The cities that rose to dominance in this new world, Lisbon, Seville, and above all Amsterdam, were not Hanseatic cities. They were organised around different principles backed by different financial instruments, connected to different sources of wealth, and they were faster, more flexible, less constrained by the accumulated norms and agreements and consensus requirements of an organisation that had been built for a different era. But I want to be careful here, because the geography argument alone does not explain the collapse. It explains the context. The League operated in that change context for another 150 years before finally dissolving. Something else was happening alongside the geographic shift. Something internal. The Hanseatic League's great strength. The thing that made it extraordinary was also the seed of its undoing. It had no central authority. For 400 years, that absence of central authority was brilliant. It meant the League was flexible, adaptive, impossible to decapitate with a single blow. It meant member cities retained their autonomy, and their loyalty to the network remained genuinely voluntary, which is almost always stronger than coerced loyalty. It meant decisions, when reached, carried enormous legitimacy, because they represented genuine consensus. But consensus requires agreement, and agreement requires that the parties involved share enough common interest to find common ground. By the 15th and 16th centuries, the member cities of the Hanseatic League were diverging. Their interests were no longer as aligned as they had once been. The western cities Hamburg, Bremen, Cologne were increasingly drawn into Atlantic trade networks, and had growing relationships with the emerging naval powers of England and the Dutch Republic. The eastern cities, Danzig, Riga, Tallinn, remained more focused on the Baltic and had different concerns, different threats, different political masters to deal with. The Prussian cities found themselves caught between the interests of the Teutonic Order's successor state and the growing power of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Every time the League tried to reach a collective decision about how to respond to the new pressures of the era, it ran into the same problem. The cities could not agree, and an organisation that operates by consensus cannot act when consensus is impossible. There is a word for this condition in modern organisational theory. Scholars call it coordination failure. The Hanseatic League died more than anything else of coordination failure. The same horizontal structure that had been its genius became, when the environment changed fast enough, its paralysis. And then the Dutch arrived. And if the Hanseatic League had a single, most painful lesson delivered to it, a moment where the future showed up and made clear that the old way of doing things was finished, it was the rise of what historians sometimes call the Dutch Golden Age. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the Dutch Republic became the most economically dynamic, most commercially innovative, most globally connected society in the world. And they did it by taking everything the Hanseatic League had built and improving it in ways that the League, constrained by its own traditions, could not match. The Dutch invented the joint stock company, the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, is often cited as the first true publicly traded corporation in history. They created a stock exchange in Amsterdam in 1602 that allowed investors to buy and sell shares, fluidly a financial instrument of unprecedented flexibility that mobilized capital on a scale the old merchant networks of the Hanse could not compete with. They built a new type of ship, the Float or flute ship, that was specifically designed to carry large volumes of cargo with a smaller crew than conventional vessels required, cheaper to operate per ton of cargo than anything the Hanseatic merchants were sailing. Where the Hanseatic League moved goods through a network of trusted partner cities and established relationships, the Dutch moved goods through financial instruments and impersonal market mechanisms that could operate at a speed and scale that personal networks simply could not match. I want to sit with that for a second, because I think it is one of the most important dynamics in all of economic history, and it plays out over and over again in different forms, across different centuries. The personal network versus the institutional market, the trusted relationship versus the liquid financial instrument. The League had always operated on the first of those things, on reputation, on established partnerships, on norms that were embedded in communities of people who knew each other, and it worked magnificently, until it met something faster. There was also a specific episode that in retrospect tells you almost everything you need to know about where the Hanseatic League stood relative to its Dutch rivals by the early 17th century. The city of Danzig today, called Gdansk in Poland, had been one of the most important Hanseatic ports on the Baltic. It was the city through which enormous quantities of Polish grain flowed westward, the city that had grown wealthy on the Baltic grain trade that fed the rest of Europe. Danzig was in many ways the eastern anchor of the Hanseatic network. In the early 17th century, Dutch merchants essentially walked into the Baltic grain trade and took it, not by force, not by political pressure, simply by offering better services, more flexible credit, lower transaction costs, and a more efficient system for connecting sellers in the Baltic with buyers across Europe and beyond. Danzig merchants, faced with the choice between the old Hanseatic way and the Dutch way, increasingly chose the Dutch way, because the Dutch way made them more money. An organisation cannot survive its own members preferring its competitors. That is not a political crisis. That is a market verdict, and market verdicts, when they are clear enough, are essentially unanswerable. Now, I've been talking about economics and geopolitics, and I want to make sure I'm not leaving you with a picture that is too bloodless. Because the collapse of the Hanseatic League was also experienced by actual human beings as a series of very personal crises. The merchants whose family businesses had operated inside the Hanseatic framework for generations. The cities that had built their entire identity around their Hanseatic membership. The workers in the warehouses and on the docks who depended on the trade flows the League had organised. The 30 Years' War, which devastated Central Europe from 1618 to 1648 and coincided almost exactly with the League's terminal decline, made everything worse. The war disrupted trade routes, destroyed cities, killed enormous numbers of people, and created a level of political and economic instability that was almost impossible for a consensus-based organisation to navigate. Several Hanseatic cities were occupied, damaged, or economically crippled during the war. By the time the Treaty of Westphalia ended the conflict in 1648, just 21 years before that last 9-city meeting in Lübeck, the League had already lost so much of its practical function that continuing it was more an act of institutional habit than of genuine utility. And here is something I think about quite a bit. The Treaty of Westphalia, which ended the 30 Years' War, is usually described by historians as one of the foundational moments of the modern international order. It established the principle of state sovereignty, the idea that nations are the primary actors in international relations, that they have exclusive authority within their own borders, and that other nations are generally not entitled to interfere in that authority. That principle, state sovereignty, was essentially the philosophical obituary of the Hanseatic League, because the League had operated in the space between states, in the gaps of sovereignty, in the places where there was no single authority powerful enough to dictate terms, and where a voluntary network of cities could fill that space with their own norms and their own power. Once the nation-state consolidated, once every piece of territory in Europe was firmly inside the jurisdiction of a sovereign power, with the ability and the will to regulate commerce on its own terms, the space the Hanseatic League had occupied simply shrank and eventually disappeared. You cannot be a stateless trading confederation in a world of strong nation-states. The two things are in the long run incompatible. So what is the lesson? Because I think there is one, a real one, not a bumper sticker. The lesson I keep returning to is this: the Hanseatic League succeeded because it was perfectly adapted to a specific set of conditions: political fragmentation, limited state capacity, the dominance of personal trust networks in long-distance commerce, the particular economics of Northern European trade in the medieval period. Every quality that made it extraordinary, its horizontal structure, its consensus governance, its reliance on collective reputation, was a response to those specific conditions. When the conditions changed, the League did not change with them. Not because the people involved were stupid. Some of them were extraordinarily intelligent and commercially sophisticated, but because changing the fundamental structure of an organization that has operated in one mode for 4 centuries is not a technical problem. It is a human problem. It means asking people who have built their identities, their fortunes, and their understanding of the world around a particular way of doing things to admit that way is no longer adequate. And that is one of the hardest things any human being is ever asked to do. I find myself thinking, and maybe you will too, about the organizations and systems in our own time that are extraordinarily well adapted to the world as it was, and less obviously suited to the world as it is becoming. I am not going to name them because that is not my job tonight. But I think you can fill in the blank for yourself. It is not a short list. 3 cities kept the Hanseatic name formally as part of their official designation for centuries after the League dissolved. Hamburg, Bremen and Lübeck still carry the prefix to this day. The official name of Hamburg in German is Freie, und Hansestadt Hamburg, the free and Hanseatic city of Hamburg. Bremen calls itself Freie Hansestadt Bremen. They kept the name not as a business designation, but as a statement of identity. A memory of what they had been, a reminder that these cities had once been part of something that answered to no single king, that had built its own laws and its own standards and its own way of ordering the world, and that had done so with extraordinary success for an extraordinarily long time. There is something quietly defiant about that, something that says we were here, we built something real, and even though it is gone, we remember what it meant. And I think that sentiment, the instinct to carry forward the memory of something that once worked beautifully even after it has passed, is one of the most human things there is, which brings us, almost without my meaning it too, to the final question of this whole evening. We have travelled from prehistoric Baltic beaches to the ruins of a 400-year-old merchant empire. We have met fishermen and shield maidens, Crusader knights and Hanseatic merchants, amber traders and Norse lawmakers. We have watched civilizations rise and fall and leave behind things they never intended to leave behind. And now I want to ask, what is still here? What did all of this actually leave us? What does the 21st century owe to those cold grey shores, that the Romans thought were the edge of the world? The answer is in the very last part of our story, and it might surprise you. So, here we are, the end of the journey, the last light before we sleep. We started tonight on a cold Baltic beach before the sun was up, with a piece of amber glowing in someone's hand, and a world that the Romans had written off as too dark and too far and too unimportant to understand. And we've travelled through herring and floods and great frozen armies and merchant empires and crusader knights and drowned cities, through 11 chapters of a story that most history books skim past in a paragraph or two to this moment. And now I owe you an answer to the question part 11 left hanging in the air. What is still here? What does the 21st century actually owe to those grey, cold, supposedly peripheral shores? The answer, I think, is going to be more personal than you expect, because the inheritance is not just institutional or political or economic. Some of it is linguistic. Some of it is so deeply embedded in the fabric of daily life that you have been using it without knowing it for your entire existence. Let me show you. Start with something small. Start with a word. Right now, wherever you are in the world, if you're watching this on a device connected to the internet, there is a reasonable chance that a significant portion of the electricity powering that connection passed through infrastructure developed by companies operating in countries whose modern commercial culture was substantially shaped by the Baltic and North Sea world we've been exploring tonight. But that connection between amber on a Baltic beach and the electrical grid of the modern world you already know about. We established that at the very beginning. The ancient Greeks called amber electron. The word electricity is the direct linguistic descendant of people picking golden stones off a stormy Baltic shore. What you may not know is how many other words you use every single day carry the same invisible ancestry. The word window. You're looking through one right now, or sitting near one, or lying in a room that has them. Window comes from the Old Norse vindauga, literally wind eye, the opening in a wall that lets the wind see in, or the person inside see the wind out. A description so precise and so physical that it replaced the word that Anglo-Saxon English had previously used, which was eightheral eye hole, because vindauga was simply better. More evocative, more alive, the word sky. You looked at it this evening, or you will in the morning, from Old Norse ski meaning cloud. The Norse sailors who navigated the North Sea and Baltic by watching the colour of the sky, reading it, studying it, arguing about what it meant for the next 24 hours of their lives, gave their word for the upper atmosphere to the English language sometime in the medieval period, where it quietly displaced older Anglo-Saxon alternatives and became the only word we now have for the vast blue thing above our heads. The word law, from Old Norse log, the plural of lag meaning that which is laid down. The thing assembly, which we talked about earlier in our journey, operated according to laws that were literally recited, laid down verbally in public before the community. The Old Norse conception of law as something placed before, people made visible and communal and spoken aloud, entered English, and became the foundation of how we talk about legal systems to this day. The words, they, them, the third-person plural pronouns of the English language. They did not come from Old English, they came from Old Norse. The original Old English forms ihira, him, were displaced by the Norse forms during the period when Norse and English-speaking communities were living in close contact in northern and eastern England. Every single time you say they or their or them, which is to say constantly in every conversation of your life, you're using words that arrived in your language because Norse traders and settlers moved through the North Sea world and brought their grammar with them. This is not a footnote. This is the fabric of thought itself altered by the encounter, and the institutional legacy is just as present if you know where to look. Consider this. The city of Hamburg today, the third largest port in Europe, processing roughly 80 million tons of cargo per year, still calls itself in its full official name the Freie und Hansestadt Hamburg, the Free and Hanseatic City of Hamburg, not as a tourist slogan, not as a nostalgic nod to a distant past, as its legal constitutional designation recognized in the German Basic Law, reflecting a political status that traces its identity continuously back to the merchant republic of the medieval period. The same is true of Bremen, Freie Hansestadt Bremen, a German state whose official self-understanding is rooted in a commercial tradition that began in the 12th century. And then there is Lufthansa, the airline you may have flown on or seen at airports or simply recognized the name of without ever wondering what it meant. Deutsche Lufthansa, German Air Hansa, the largest airline in Europe named without apology or irony after a medieval merchant confederation that dissolved 3.5 centuries ago. Luft meaning air, Hansa meaning the League. Every time a Lufthansa plane crosses the Atlantic or the Pacific or any ocean in the world, it is carrying the name of Baltic and North Sea merchants, who first demonstrated that commercial networks could operate across vast distances without the support of any king. Now I want to tell you about something that happened in February of 2018, because it is, I think, one of the most quietly remarkable pieces of evidence for the enduring relevance of what we've been talking about. Finance ministers from 8 countries met and signed a document setting out their shared positions on European monetary policy. The countries were Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Ireland, Latvia, Lithuania, the Netherlands and Sweden. Small to medium nations, Northern European nations, nations whose economic cultures have been shaped over centuries by the same Baltic and North Sea commercial tradition we have traced tonight. They named their group the New Hanseatic League, not as a historical joke, not as a bit of charming medieval cosplay, as a genuine statement of shared identity and values, fiscal conservatism, trade, openness, rule-based economic governance, suspicion of large centralized power telling smaller members what to do. All the core principles of the original league translated into 21st century monetary policy. The medieval merchant confederation that officially dissolved in 1669 in a room with 9 representatives where once there had been hundreds is still naming international political alliances. That is a very long afterlife for an organization with no king, no army, and no permanent headquarters. But here is the inheritance I find most profound, the one that is most difficult to see precisely because it is so thoroughly absorbed into the structures we take for granted. The Hanseatic League created imperfectly contradictorily, with all the limitations and blind spots of its era, a model for organizing human cooperation that was genuinely new in the world. The model said you do not need a sovereign authority at the top. You do not need a king to grant the framework within which commerce happens. You can build the framework yourself from the bottom up through voluntary agreement, through shared rules that serve everyone's interests, through a reputation system that disciplines members more effectively than any external enforcement mechanism. This model failed eventually. We talked about how and why it failed in Part 11. The nation-state won that particular historical competition, but the model did not disappear. It went dormant, and then it reappeared in different forms in different contexts across the following centuries. The founders of the European Union were explicit about this. The historian Philippe Dollinger, who wrote the definitive study of the Hanseatic League in the 20th century, described the League as the forerunner of the European project, not as a metaphor, as a literal ancestor and earlier attempt to solve the same fundamental problem that the EU was trying to solve. How do you get independent states each with their own interests and identities to cooperate consistently enough that everyone benefits from the cooperation? How do you build a framework that is strong enough to function, but flexible enough to accommodate members who will never fully surrender their autonomy. The Hanseatic merchants did not answer that question finally or permanently, but they asked it first. They built the first serious experimental answer in the Baltic and North Sea world, and they ran it for 400 years, and when it failed, it left behind enough wreckage and enough memory that the people who came afterward had at least one data point to work with. There is also a more personal kind of legacy that I want to sit with for a moment before we close. We've talked tonight about people who lived in conditions of genuine difficulty. The Norse fisherman before dawn, the woman running the household for months while her husband was at sea, the Baltic coast community rebuilding its dikes after a flood that killed thousands, the young merchant in Bergen learning to survive a winter in a commercial compound far from home. These were not easy lives. The hardship was real and constant and sometimes fatal, and yet across all of those lives certain qualities reappear so consistently that they begin to feel like something essential, something that the environment itself selected for generation after generation. A particular kind of pragmatic resilience, a willingness to build cooperative structures with people you might otherwise compete with, because the alternative, going it alone in a genuinely hostile environment, was simply worse. A respect for law and agreement not as impositions from above, but as the practical architecture of collective survival. A readiness to innovate, to try new approaches, to let the logic of a better solution override the comfort of familiar habits. These are not uniquely northern virtues. People develop similar qualities in many demanding environments across the world, but they emerge with particular intensity along these specific coasts in these specific conditions, producing people and institutions that punched extraordinarily far above their geographic weight for an extraordinarily long time. And I find myself wondering, because this is the question I always come back to at the end of these journeys, whether the qualities that environment produces are actually transferable, whether the resilience and the cooperative instinct and the willingness to build frameworks rather than simply fight for dominance are things that can be learned, or whether they require a particular kind of cold grey water to grow in. I think they can be learned. I think that is actually what they were doing in those Hanseatic merchant houses, teaching each other, through years of immersion and practice, the habits of mind that the northern seas had originally demanded. And I think every community that finds itself in difficulty navigating an environment that makes no promises and offers no easy paths has access to the same curriculum. The sea is indifferent to your ambitions. The storm does not care about your plans. The question is not whether the difficulty will come. It will. The question is what you build in response. Before we end, I want to take you back to the beach one more time. It is still there. The Baltic coast, the same coast we started on tonight, is still producing amber. Every autumn storm still churns the seabed and deposits golden pieces on the dark, wet sand. People still walk down to the shore after the weather passes and pick them up and hold them to the light and see the ancient gold warm in their palms. Some of those pieces are 40 or 50 million years old. They contain sometimes tiny, perfect insects. Flies, gnats, occasional beetles suspended mid-motion in translucent golden resin, as if time simply stopped around them. Scientists have extracted ancient genetic material from some of these inclusions. The insects are so perfectly preserved that researchers have been able to read biological information that would otherwise have been lost completely, information about ancient ecosystems, ancient diseases, ancient evolutionary relationships. The amber is in this quite literal sense a hard drive, a storage medium that predates all human technology, carrying information forward through time at no cost, with no maintenance, with no infrastructure required beyond the willingness of the next generation of coastal people to walk down to the water and pick up what the sea leaves behind. This has been going on for 40,000 years. It is going on tonight somewhere on the Baltic shore, even as we sit here together in the dark. And somewhere in a museum in Cairo, the pectoral breastplate of Tutankhamun still contains its Baltic amber beads. A pharaoh's treasure connecting two shores across 3,000 years and 3,000 miles through no mechanism more complicated than the human desire to have beautiful things and the human willingness to travel impossible distances to get them. That is what these coasts gave the world. Not just fish and ships and commercial law and the pronouns of the English language. Not just the framework for what would eventually become the European Union or the conceptual ancestor of the world's largest airline. Those are the measurable things, the things that fit in a sentence or a statistic. What these coasts also gave the world, what I believe is the deepest and most durable part of the inheritance, is a particular kind of argument. An argument made not in words but in action across centuries of evidence. The argument that ordinary people in difficult places without anyone's permission can build something extraordinary. Not in spite of the difficulty, but because of it. Because the difficulty required them to be more cooperative, more creative, more attentive to the world around them than comfort would have allowed. The grey seas were not a disadvantage, they were the curriculum. Well, we've come a long way together tonight. From a Baltic beach in the Stone Age to a merchant republic in the 15th century, to the name of a modern airline and the pronouns in your own mouth. From amber on the shore of Egypt to 9 cities in a room in Lübeck in 1669 quietly acknowledging an ending. From a fisherman before dawn to a woman running a commercial empire from a merchant house in Hamburg, while the official records recorded someone else's name. These were real people. They lived fully loved, stubbornly built things that outlasted them by centuries and died in floods and plagues and ordinary old age and the kind of anonymous exhaustion that does not make it into history books. They deserve to be remembered. And I am deeply glad we spent this time remembering them together. If this journey meant something to you tonight, if you find yourself thinking about amber differently, or about the sea, or about the extraordinary persistence of ordinary human beings in the face of what the world hands them, please leave a comment below and tell me what landed for you. I genuinely read every single one, and knowing which parts of these stories reach people is how I figure out which stories to tell next. If you have been with me through this whole evening and you are not yet subscribed, this is the moment to change that, because there are a dozen more journeys like this one waiting, and I would love for you to be there for them. But for right now, wherever you are, whatever your own particular grey sea looks like, I hope you sleep well. The shore will still be there in the morning, and the amber patient, as it has always been, will still be glowing in the sand. Good night.